Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the part 1 of What If Deku Was a 500-year-old vampire? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. It was a bright sunny day. Not one that you'd link with anything particularly malicious or evil, at least, until you looked below the surface veneer. The streets, while certainly not piled with trash and stained ominously like they were in some neighborhoods, were not pristine either, and the shadows seemed to congregate a little more than they should around the bases of permanent fixtures. The alleyways often had limp bodies tossed partway through, although whether sleeping, unconscious, or dead nobody but a few bothered to check. Most simply stepped over them, as Midoriya Izuku was doing as he hurried to school. While he wasn't cruel, he was on a schedule and running a bit later than normal due to needing to clean up a spill from his hasty meal that morning, the drink in question still halfway filling a battered, dented thermos that most would say was full of an oddly thick, slightly pungent smoothie, be older than the small boy carrying it, and see a bit rusted. None of these suppositions were correct, although they were all reasonable assumptions. While the drink was somewhat smoothie, having some fruit blended in, it was certainly nothing you'd ever find in any cookbook outside of 2 specialty shops deep in the Romanian mountains, and the scent had sunken into the thermos over many years of use. And while the thermos was certainly older than the 14 years that Midoriya Izuku appeared to possess on this mortal sphere, the truth was that Midoriya Izuku was, in fact, approaching his 485th birthday in a matter of months. The tiny green-haired boy pushing his way through the morning rush on this particular clear morning was, in fact, a vampire, and a reasonably old one at that, although few would be able to tell based on his current state 14, and currently bound as a fledgling until he'd fully age out of it. Midoriya took another long pull from his smoothie. Really, it was blood from the butcher's shop mixed with enough blended fruit to cover up most of the distinct iron tang and thicken the texture enough to seem like a smoothie and not something he could get staked for, or worse, burnt. The crowds continued pushing, everybody trying to start their day, until a loud crash rang out. Calmy Woods was fighting a large villain, and while ordinarily Midoriya would have stayed, watching to see what both would do and how one of the rising rescue heroes was making a name for himself in combat, he needed to get to school before he was late. Although not officially harassed, he was still disliked, whether for his odd habits, chilling aura, or simply the fact that he refused to show off or speak about his quirk. Most teachers would be much stricter on him, and since there were only about 10 months until entrance exam season would start, black marks on records would be much harder to scrub out. The crowds kept ebbing and flowing, most choosing to stop and watch the fight, especially once MP Lady showed up, loud, proud, and bold, but Midoriya simply kept pushing through, despite the constant itch in the back of his head. Come on, write it down, you've already learned all of it, there's hardly a class in there you need to take, you do enough on your own, and managed to make it to school a comfortable 5 minutes before class would start. Quickly swapping out his outdoor shoes for his school ones, he quickly hurried through the halls, doing his best to make it to class where he could settle quietly and nobody would bother pushing him around when they could wait and not worry about getting in trouble. Luck indeed seemed to shine upon him, as he managed to make it to class without any incidents and find his seat without any major damage. About half of the class hadn't shown up yet, and the ones who had generally chose to ignore him, although one seemed to stare, ready to try something before losing their courage and shifting to sit more solidly in their chair. Classes were the same as always, the same old information he'd taught himself over long board nights when all he had was a silenced laptop and the thoughts in his head to keep him busy. Even history, one of his favorite classes, was dull. Their grade was shifting into reviews, allowing people to still get the new content they needed while preparing them for high school or any other specific education they were going for. The last class of the day was the first time Midoriya really pulled himself out of his head and paid attention. They were supposed to be talking about high school choices and options, planning out your applications in advance so that you knew what to focus on. However, the teacher was, like he always was, never interested in actually corralling his class of rowdy teenagers ready to be let loose on an unsuspecting world, and maintained his pattern, not only letting people loose with their quirks, throwing the career assessment forms everywhere and preventing those who, while taking the opportunity to let loose, did not actually seek a career in heroics from getting the help and direction they needed. What was worse was that after letting Bakugo yell, a common practice that kept explosions and collateral damage to a minimum, he outed Midoriya's own intent to apply to UA. Bakugo was notably upset about this. What do you think you're doing, Deku? You've got a worthless quirk, if you have one at all. You won't be able to pass, you'll just end up as a pebble beneath the feet of the ones who actually deserve to get in. He turned aside. On most days, this would be all, and for that, Midoriya was grateful. Burns hit his kind much harsher than others, and took longer to heal as well, and last week's were still a bit tender. But one of Bakugo's lackeys, the one who could extend his fingers, noticed the notebook he was scribbling in. Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13 was written on the cover, and Midoriya had been going over the fight he'd seen on the way to school, preparing space for the newly debuted hero as well as commentary on Calmy Woods. The lackey, Midoriya, couldn't be bothered to keep track of the names of people who he tried to forget existed as long as he wasn't in school, grabbed it, waving it in Bakugo's face. "Hey, Bakugo! The nerd's got a stalker notebook." Bakugo turned, snatching the notebook and skimming through. At least the faint runes he'd drawn on some of the pages kept him from seeing the more sensitive pages, but he clearly wasn't impressed. "What's up with the creepy notebook, Deku? Think you'll be worth anything just 'cause you follow heroes around in your spare time and write down the junk you see?" He shut the book, lit off a few small explosions in his palms, charring the cover but fortunately not damaging most of the pages beyond the edges, and tossing it out the window. Midoriya tracked it as it spun out the window, knowing that he could grab it before it even passed the glass or even be able to stop Bakugo from attacking him, but then questions would start being asked and he didn't want the attention or the curiosity. Just as the notebook dropped out of view, he opened a small pocket and let the singed notebook fall into the space where he kept his others, as he didn't want to test the fine runes he'd only recently put in against the attention of the whole school. Bakugo, evidently upset that he wasn't getting more of a reaction, or perhaps just in a worse mood than normal, decided to fire off one more closing shot before he left. "If you really want to be a hero, here's a suggestion. Take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a better quirk, or maybe one at all in the next life." Midoriya froze. Swan dive? The phrase echoed in his head, and he knew that Bakugo had crossed a line. Before, he was an annoyance, dangerous, yes, but no more so than a flaming spider demon in the mountains, either not intelligent enough to really provide a challenge if you were aware, or pushing towards a different goal and willing to let another pass reasonably unscathed, but now he had started pushing further. Now it was becoming worryingly personal. He'd have to be more aware of him and work harder to disappear. Midoriya headed outside, following the path not to the tiny apartment he rented so he had his own space but to the well-disguised set of roads that would lead to the others. After the day he'd had, something quiet inside him pushed for settling in close to the others, and even though they weren't likely to be there, they'd both been clear that he was welcome anytime. Ducking to enter the old pipe, he felt something squish and paused. This pipe was supposed to be dry. Midoriya turned, ready to bolt. Unfortunately, the sludge was already rising, surrounding him and cutting him off from the room he needed to work. It was clearly alive, speaking to him. "Thanks, kid." A medium-sized invisibility cloak. "Didn't know he'd be here, but lucky you came by, you're my hero." Midoriya was clawing at the sludge, eyes half-lidded and trying to get to the eyes, the only solid part. He was still pretending to be alive, so he did, regrettably, need oxygen, and he was fairly certain that being alive was part of what kept holding the sludge being back. He tried to scream, shout, bite, anything, but as soon as he opened his mouth, sludge poured in. "Ah, don't be so upset about it. 45 seconds, then it'll be painless," the sludge villain cheerfully told him. Midoriya clawed again, managing to grab onto an eyeball. "Hey, what are you dash?" Midoriya was trying to puncture the eyeball with his nails, but he never managed, as a huge gust of wind and a shout were the last things he noticed before his head violently impacted the tunnel wall. Detroit smash. It was only a minute before he awoke, to a large, brightly colored figure smacking his face. It was probably meant to be light, but with his size and sheer muscularity, It likely would have bruised if he didn't have a bit of a healing factor. "Oh good, you're alive." Midoriya snorted, but the figure ignored him as Midoriya shifted, twitching slightly to try to get his vision to focus. "Do not fear, for I am here." With that iconic line, Midoriya knew who was in front of him. All Might. The #1 hero in Japan for over 20 years, notably strong and well cemented in the image of a hero. "Indeed, it is I, young citizen. I would have arrived earlier, but these sewers are more difficult than I expected to navigate. But now this villain has been apprehended, and so I must be going," boomed the tall hero, showing off the 2 still open soda bottles holding slime and eyeballs, including one with a long, noticeable scratch down most of its length. Hastily, Midoriya widened his eyes, taking advantage of the fact that as a fledgling he was full of features deemed cute by many species: big eyes, round face, soft hair that fluffed easily, and tried to speak up. "I have a question." All Might cut him off. "Already done." He presented a worn, battered notebook, the one that wasn't his. It was clear that he wouldn't be able to ask his question, but as Midoriya looked over the mess, he saw that one of his notebooks had fallen out of his bag. He hadn't had time to put it back, but he was wishing he'd just done so, no matter that he'd be putting himself in more danger to do so. This notebook was one in which he tried to work out what information was true, what was experience, and what was lies his BSTRD of a sire had told him 4.5 centuries ago. Midoriya's vision tunneled, and he lunged for it. If it got loose, there was simply too much data. All his friends would be in danger. Even the ones not named directly would be exposed, and he'd known the laws well enough not to break the first, not to reveal the existence of the supernatural to the general populace. So focused was he on his notebook that he completely ignored the brightly colored man preparing to leap away, so both were taken by surprise when he had a passenger on his leap away from the sewer. When they'd landed, on top of a tall building, Midoriya took a moment to collect himself and tuck his notebook back into its pocket where it wouldn't be in danger again. A cloud of steam poofed across the roof, and he turned to see what was going on, only to see a skeletal blonde man in the same clothes All Might was wearing, although they were hanging loosely, less form-fitting. He coughed up blood and looked like he was expecting questions. Midoriya paused. He could actually ask the question. "Do you think somebody with a weak quirk or none at all could be a hero?" While it would be interesting to hear, he was going into training no matter what. This would show whether it was merely a poor impression or... All Might, or whatever his civilian name was, paused, taken aback, then paused, thinking for a few seconds. Midoriya took the pause to stop his heart, relaxing as the pressures of life seemed to slip away for however long he'd be able to exist in his natural state. "I do not think so, young citizen." He lifted the hem of his shirt, revealing a large scar. It smelt strongly of blood, and seemed to not have healed well. "I got this scar 5 years ago, fighting against a strong villain. I have a strong quirk." One side of his mouth twitched at that, "and even then I took a lot of damage. So no, I do not think so. They would only be a burden on the field. Perhaps in the police force or a more realistic goal. Something that would not have them leaping into danger far beyond their ability to handle. Now, I really must be going. You can knock at the door, they'll let you down." And with that, he inflated back into his All Might form and leaped away, not even noticing the way the sludge seemed to be twitching more. Midoriya stood there, thinking. So it was true. Tsukachi would be disappointed, but the others wouldn't be, and at this point it was just one more obstacle firmly against their path. He walked over to the railing, looking out to see the other options. There was a route easy enough to reach for him, perhaps not for a normal human, but for a vampire with over 400 years of experience, it was reasonable. He leaped, ready to skip over and see about the coven. It was later now, more would be home. As he was hurrying past a small plaza, however, the chatter caught his attention, as did the sound of explosions and the familiar gurgle of the sludge villain. Midoriya paused. Had that pile of sludge gotten loose already? It certainly seemed so. He wiggled through the crowd, quietly mourning his old height. 5'7" wasn't huge in these modern times, but for a weaver back in the 19th century, that was quite a lot. But now, for 11' and looking 14, it was much harder to see over the shoulders of the crowd and make his way to where he could, especially since there didn't even seem to be a direction. Some were pushing forwards, while some were trying to hurry to the back. Once he'd made it to the front of the crowd, he could see what was going on. Stared, taken aback. It was the sludge villain, loose and unrestrained, with a furious Bakugo inside of the main pool of sludge. Bakugo was setting off explosions, which, admittedly, were keeping the sludge away from enough of him that he wasn't being taken over, but were also keeping the heroes away and causing damage. Backdraft was busy putting out fires from when the explosions got too close to flammable things, while Calmy Woods was trying to get civilians out of the flaming, unstable buildings and stands, while keeping some back from the fight. Emmy Lady was kneeling on one of the side streets, evidently too narrow for her to move down, especially with Calmy circling and blocking where she theoretically could have jumped to, and reaching, trying to grab the sludge and get the hostage out, although she kept yelping and pulling her hand back, likely from the heat of the explosions. Death Arms and a few lesser-known sidekicks were standing back, Death Arms lightly singed but otherwise untouched, and the sidekicks trying to keep the media and crowds back so that the explosions would hurt fewer people. Death Arms turned slightly, checking the angle of the cameras, before shifting his position to a more settled one, confident that nobody would notice him standing back instead of trying to do something. For just a moment, Midoriya hesitated. He didn't have to help. In fact, doing so would do nothing for him and put him in range of those terrible, burning explosions, and worse, the media. Then he paused, drained the last dregs of his smoothie. He'd planned to finish it at lunch, but hadn't found the time, and threw the thermos at the previously damaged eye, charging with it and tossing his backpack towards the other eye. The sludge villain reeled back, one worn edge of the thermos scratching the eye further and the thick iron tang causing him to further lean back, spitting the thermos out. Midoriya darted in and pulled the quickly exposed limb, fortunately a leg, less chance of explosions to the face, and hauled Bakugo out of the line of fire. As soon as he was far enough away that the explosions he was still letting off weren't likely to hit her, Lady stood to her full height, over 20 meters, and leaped into the plaza, driving her heels firmly into the area of sludge where the villain had his eyes and leaving a small crater, only lightened by the fact that as soon as she'd firmly connected, she jumped back and shrank, falling to the ground in her smaller height. With the fires no longer being started, Calmy Woods was able to circle the crater and keep the villain trapped, while Backdraft, after finally beating back the last section and passing it over to the newly arrived firefighters, started diluting the sludge. Death Arms still stood back and did nothing, a few sidekicks siding him as they started directing civilian traffic to other routes, calling in a repair team to fix the crater once the pool of goo that had been the sludge villain had been transferred to a hastily woven basket of capture tape that seemed to be what MT Lady had been working on off to the side. Midoriya didn't really care about it. It was a lovely case of non-coordinating quirks being used creatively, and any other day he'd be noting it down eagerly, but he was trying to avoid the paramedics. After never restarting his heart, he really didn't want to be declared legally dead while still walking around, especially since the quirk he'd registered had no connection to his heart. Instead, he'd taken off as soon as the diluted villain was being transferred to the basket, working through the back alleys and hopping over yet another potential corpse. It didn't smell remotely dead, but he was trying to get someplace and getting blown up would slow him down, and Bakugo disliked the alleys, claiming they stank. They did, but it was possible to get used to it, didn't make it better, and it often hid details he'd want to know, but compared to burns? Odd sense that stuck in the nose was the better deal. 15 minutes later, he was quietly padding through a neighborhood very much unlike the one he lived in, although it was surprisingly near. The houses were surprisingly distanced, and there was more space behind them. Hedges and trees lined the street, blocking views without causing too much of a ruckus. Finally, he found the one he was looking for, a stone wall covered in ivy, hedges in front of it combining to keep up the look from the rest of the neighborhood, and used the convenient ivy to make it up the wall. Most would not have called it convenient, as it really only crept thinly over some of the wall, never a consistent path to the top, but that was little to a very stubborn vampire. Hopping lightly to the ground, knowing that the neighborhood prided itself on discretion, he relaxed further, knowing he didn't have to hide within the high stone walls. Midoriya's gait shifted as he walked down the well-worn cobbled path, until by the time he was at the door of the house, he was moving with the grace and ease that almost 500 years and supernatural reflexes granted. He didn't bother knocking, just inserted his key and headed in, towing his shoes off and swapping them for his house slippers. Inside, Shoyuta was draped over the couch, a pile of grading 3/4 of the way done, and the look on the parts of his face visible under his black hair spoke of not a coherent paper among any of them. While his previous class had been average, half of them ended up leaving, whether by choice or force was variable. The remaining group usually ended up surviving well, although he never followed them up, choosing instead to pass them on to the next teacher, and one if any would end up underground. This class was apparently the worst he'd had in a while. A full third ended up gone on the first day. By now, 6 weeks later, half of the remainder was gone, and judging by the look on Shuta's face, the remaining 7 would be gone before another month had gone by. In the kitchen, Hizashi was humming to himself, stirring up something that would end up as dinner. While he wasn't as good as Oboro was, very few people were, and they all managed to be healthy, and the scent did a lot for perking up Izuku's mood. He headed quietly up the stairs, past the old, slightly stained wooden door that led to one of the only rooms in the house he refused to enter, and twisted the brass handle to his room. Dumping his backpack next to the desk, Izuku took a moment to simply exist in the peace of his space. High ceiling with glow-in-the-dark paint and fairy lights simulating a night sky, pale mint walls contrasting nicely with the rich brown carpet, wide windows overlooking the backyard, and his tools arranged so that he'd have sunlight and a hanging lamp to do his work by. There was no bed, although there was a rope seat swinging nicely in the corner, just the right size to curl up in and relax, big enough that if he needed company, one of the others could fit, small enough he didn't feel he was drowning. For a moment, Izuku considered settling in at his desk to do his homework, then brushed it aside. He could do it later, in the long hours of night, since he wasn't going out for another week. For now, he simply changed out of his uniform, into a pair of comfortable sweats and a labeled t-shirt, and headed back downstairs to commiserate with Shoyuta. For almost half an hour, neither actually said anything, simply getting as close as they could to napping while deceased and enjoying the presence of another being who they could be genuine around. But even as immortals with theoretically unlimited time, deadlines still existed, and finally Shoyuta sat up to finish grading the last 2 papers. They didn't take long. From the faint mumbles Izuku was paying attention to, they were the last 2 competent people in the class and transferring to management in 2 weeks. Once that was done, he shifted, letting Izuku remain leaning against his side while letting the writing posture he'd maintained from those lessons all those years ago slide away. Neither still said anything, but Shoyuta started pushing on the beginnings of the coven bond, sending the support Izuku didn't quite realize he'd needed, and let himself relax, not willing to start it, but willing to answer questions, when Hizashi called them both in for dinner. Now, if Tensei or Namuri were there would have been more, but it had been a fairly even day and both had lives outside them, so on the table was a light fish soup and smoothies, both with that familiar iron tang that reminded Izuku that, although he'd had his morning smoothie, he'd also had a really rough day. They circled around the table, the empty spot in between Shoyuta and Hizashi a quiet reminder of that loss from all those years ago, and with a quiet itadakimasu, they dug in. The soup was good, although both Tensei and Namuri had laughed at their recipe. Spinach was perfectly good with fish, last time any of them had checked, and it helped balance out their physical workloads. And the plastic wrap over the flat smoothie cups helped remind them that they were feeding, although none of them really got as much of that as they'd really enjoy. Finally, the food had been finished, and as Izuku finished carefully draining the last of the iron-rich smoothie from its container, Hizashi carefully lowered his bowl and cleared his throat slightly. "So, Izuku, you certainly had a day, didn't you?" He couldn't look up. Logically, this wasn't his fault. Logically, this wasn't anyone's fault, and he's certainly not the one to blame for anything, but all that anxiety never really goes away, and he hasn't spent enough time with them to really process that they do, in fact, care about him and not what he is, his age or experience or powers. Part of it does help. Part of it is that they're all within about 20 years of him. Hizashi, the youngest, ended up being 18 years younger than him, and they've known each other for almost as long as they've all been alive. But he's been gone for lots of that, and even though he's seen them care, it still can't break past the whispers of heartless, monster, my tool, my. A hand on his knee broke him out of it and he slowly lifted his head. Neither looked upset. Shoyuta looked his normal, tired, worn down by people yet refusing to give them up, while Hisashi simply looked somewhat concerned. You doing alright? Anything we need to know about first aid to handle, people to put on the Nezdu list? The last had Izuku snort. They did have such a list, people to throw to Nezdu when they had evidence to deal with them, keeping him busy enough to satisfy his less-than-moral issues with humanity while keeping the school itself mostly safe from his chaos. Mostly alright, nothing that really needs to be treated, maybe check over my throat before a huge training session. That sludge was icky but seems to be mostly gone. He paused, before continuing. He deserved this. Also, All Might can evidently deflate, took damage in a major villain attack 5 years ago, likely covered up, since we found no information about it. He also is biased enough that he shut down the idea of even a weak-quirked hero after only a minute. Tsukachi will be disappointed, but I don't think he's going to change. Shoyuta nodded. He's been doing this, what, 30-40 years? If he's not changed from that, he's not changing now. And we're going to need to shift some of it forwards, since it appears we've got a reason for the decrease in public action. Since he's not preparing, we do need to let Nezdu know we know, but then again, he paused, a chilling grin splitting his face. For once, his partner and his friend grinned back in ways neither of them generally did in public. Then again, who says we need to let him know immediately? Hisashi's smile shifted from threat to humor easily, still showing more teeth than most were comfortable with but letting gleaming fangs out to help wear them back. And after what he said, don't think we're not talking more about that later, you're definitely getting into UA. And you know what that means. Izuku swallowed. Everything was changing fast, and although he thrived in chaos like the others, there was something in Hisashi's tone that told him he wouldn't be looking forward to the next 10 months. No what? Innocence and cuteness was, as always when he was still this small, his best option. Hisashi's smile did not change or dim at all, perhaps even spreading a little wider. Training. Midoriya was correct. The previous 10 months had been a lot. Most of it, surprisingly, wasn't purely physical, not that it wasn't physical, but it was more of a focus on picking up and retaining information while keeping up with a parkour course, pushing forwards his agility and memory. There was also a lot to deal with that his previous sire had never taught him, most of it intentionally. Not now, not today. Izuku shoved those thoughts aside, slurping deeply from his latest smoothie. Maybe Tenya would be there, although he hadn't seen him in a good while. The blue-haired boy had stated his intention to try for the regular exam, so they could meet up before the exam started to wish each other luck. It was quite nice that Tensei had brought his brother, as somebody near Midoriya's physical and emotional age, and they had made a third friend on their runs, although he was. Hands covered Izuku's eyes, the gangly form of the third member of their chaotic group draping himself over Izuku's shorter form. In what had become routine, he simply shifted, leaning forward, and continued carrying Hitoshi forwards as the taller boy buried his face in Izuku's curls. Tenya wasn't there yet, but as they headed into the large auditorium, Hitoshi could see their tall friend standing by an entrance, clearly waiting for them. They all filed in next to each other, 3 in a line with Hitoshi in the middle, Tenya on the left, and Izuku on the right. While waiting for the exam to start, the 3 were whispering about plans. The Shinsis were well known in the heroic medical community, which was notoriously secretive. The Idas had the family agency, although both parents had retired from full active duty and were on part-time, often working with various hero schools in the upper years to help them understand the ins and outs of agencies. And nobody had figured out who Midoriya was connected to, and he intended to keep it that way until he graduated, and setting up more times to meet up and keep training together. Of course, not all of it was training. The 3 were chaotic, albeit different flavors of such, and a decent chunk of their time was spent working pranks and other schemes. Finally, Present Mike walked up to the front to begin the practical, starting with a classic, "Can I get a yeah?" Crickets could have been heard with how quiet the auditorium was, and for a half-second the voice hero looked disappointed, then smug. "All right then, listeners. You're here for the hero course practical. If you're not, you're in the wrong place and you need to get settled elsewhere, all right? If not, then welcome." He paused, pulling up a presentation on the large screen behind him. The practical will be mock battles in one of several testing areas, which will be marked on your testing ticket. While all this information is in your testing packet, I'd like to go over it before we send you out there, get it? Mike continued explaining the rules and expectations, but when he got to the points section he was interrupted. Excuse me? You only mentioned 3 options for getting points, but there are 4 robot types mentioned in the packet, proclaimed Ida. He would have said more, but Shinso pulled him back down, one hand over his mouth. Mike didn't look particularly upset about being called out. Great point, Examinee 1771. The 4th type is worth 0 points, and there will only be 1 in each testing zone. My advice is just to ignore it. It's not worth anything, and you'll be able to get more points in other places. Something rang a little hollow in that explanation, but Mike was steamrollering on. Alright, so before we leave, I have a few words of advice. Just treat it like a real villain fight and you'll be fine. Give it your best and push forward. Plus ultra. The rest of the auditorium repeated his cheer, then people started streaming outward. Both Ida and Midoriya were in Site B, while Shinso was in Site D, so they split up after changing quickly in the locker rooms. The bus ride was quiet and tense, and as they pooled into the antechamber, many chose to simply stand there, tense and anxious. Ida and Midoriya joined a few others in stretching to warm up, and Midoriya caught sight of a brown-haired girl with pink cheeks who looked a few seconds from a panic attack. When he went to go over, to see if he could help, Ida pulled him back, a quiet whisper of not making her any more anxious before a big fight. Finally, just as the quiet murmur that was all the applicants felt able to make was beginning to rise to a boil, President Mick's voice came over the speakers. The test has begun. You have 10 minutes. Ida and Midoriya jumped slightly, then bolted into the city in opposite directions. A few others followed behind, the brown-haired girl one of them, but over half of the group were simply standing there, frozen. Distantly, they heard President Mick's voice encouraging them forwards, but both boys pushed it aside in favor of the test itself. Ida used his kicks to take down a consistent string of robots, although sometimes he had to run rings around the robots to keep them from toppling onto another applicant or shove somebody out of the way. He tried to keep it looking accidental so they wouldn't yell at him, but kept feeling like he was a faker for pushing them away from problems they could likely solve on their own. Midoriya had been bouncing off the buildings, taking off the heads or tearing out the cables of bots, but he spent most of his time hauling people out of situations that were more than they could deal with. Time flew by, and the testing area shook. Both boys moved towards the middle of the area, where the zero-pointer towered. Ida circled 3 times, hurting people away from its height, while Midoriya yanked the brown-haired girl out from under some debris. She grabbed a large chunk, did something with her quirk, lightening it, perhaps, and threw it at the zero-pointer, touching her fingers together at its apex and watching it crush the head of the towering robot. Once the two were out of range, Ida coming up to see if both were all right, President Mick's voice rang out, notifying them that the exam was over. Midoriya promptly dropped to the ground, letting the girl, who introduced herself as Uraraka before puking her guts out, roll off his shoulders and curl up by some wreckage. Ida was sitting on another piece, rubbing the ache out of his calves as Recovery Girl passed by, spreading her healing kisses to Ida and Uraraka and passing out gummies to the 3 of them. Izuku wasn't doing well. He was tired and listless, and hadn't been able to use his magic nearly as much in the exam as he'd like to have done. Tearing out wires was much better than simply tearing off heads, but he'd planned on being able to pull pockets to trap bits of heels and limbs to disarm, disable or trip the robots so he didn't have to show off nearly as much. However, every time he'd tried to open a pocket, it was either much bigger or much further away than he'd wanted, in a few cases simply sparking out as he'd hit his current limits. Something was wrong and weird and he didn't know what was going on, but he was just so tired. It was fortunate that the written exams were the previous day, because Izuku wasn't sure he was going to be able to function much, if at all, at home, when he didn't have to pretend that things were all right. Tenya had followed him, keeping him upright when he started wobbling, but left once he'd made it safely to the door. It made sense, he likely wanted to spend time with his brother, as Tensei wasn't always available when Tenya was and they wanted to make the most of it. They'd meet up later with Shinso at the clearing or Miyowafu to talk about their experience anyways. Izuku flopped on the couch, boneless, and regretted it immediately. Every muscle seemed to have decided that it was time to rebel. He didn't know how long he laid there, riding out the waves of bone-deep pain and the faint pangs of hunger, too tired and sore to even think about getting up, but eventually the couch dipped beside him. Looking up, it was Hisashi, which made sense. The Gen Ed classes were often divided academically, and since he wasn't a heroics teacher, Mike didn't need to be there beyond the first meeting to declare overviews. Shoyuta, on the other hand, would be pulling late nights the entire week, as he and Vlad King would need to debate and figure out who would deal better with the blunt shutdowns of Aizawa or the encouragement at the cost of DSPLN of Vlad. Hisashi poked at Izuku's shoulder, and winced at the low that Izuku gave. "Hungry?" the blonde whispered. Izuku nodded, ready for him to get up and bring a smoothie or one of Shuta's pouches. Instead, he picked him up, shifting them both to be sitting propped against each other, and brushed his hair away from the side of his neck, tilting his head to expose the blood vessels for better reach. "Why?" asked Izuku, still a bit out of it but not understanding. Hisashi, his sire, had always said that it was wrong, and although he'd seen it done enough that he knew it wasn't, he still wasn't sure what it was. Hisashi looked slightly pained, as he always had when Izuku showed something that spoke of how bad his sire had been at teaching him how to be a proper vampire. "You're hitting growing pains, likely physically as well as magically. We'll keep an eye on you for a few other things, but it should be a week before you're settled. The first shed is likely to happen, among other things. You could use the extra boost and besides, you're properly in our coven now and this will help you stabilize." So saying, he shifted so that Izuku really only had to lean forwards and bite to drink his fill. And if Hisashi was offering, his blood smelling nicer than chilled pig's blood the more Izuku thought about it, then who was Izuku to refuse? His fangs lowered, and Izuku leaned in, a quick lick to clean the skin. Even though most vampires were resistant to infection, before sinking them deep into the exposed vessels and pulling. It was entirely different, even from Hisashi's that faint taste from almost 500 years ago, sweet and rich and full of varied flavors, yet without that one missing element of vitality. Once his hunger was mostly sated, Izuku pulled away before offering his own neck for the younger vampire. It was only polite, and there was takeout for entrance exam week anyways. The blonde took the implicit invitation and bit, and Izuku relaxed into the unfamiliar feeling. If this was what the bloodbound felt, no wonder they kept offering. Hisashi pulled away once he was finished, and the matching wounds quickly faded, the only traces the remnants of the thick dark blood that seeped into their skin. There was takeout to have, along with a few experiments they were trying to see if they could make taiyaki with blood or a blood variant, as the pouches and tea were getting suspicious, and a supplement could only get passed off for so long. But it was night and they were light, conversation flowing freely as they bantered and worked, both tired and unlikely to change until 6 days from now, the night before the results went out, when Shoyuta would properly return home and they could all relax as full of a coven as they could be with one mate of the bonded trio still trapped. The cats were quiet, the owls hooted, and the moon rose high over the quiet night. Midoriya was tired. His teen fangs were still coming in. He'd shot up 2 inches over the past week and was now trying to deal with the new center of gravity and longer limbs, and his spine was itching as the rune layout shifted, the old sets to hide his presence and help him find shelter, shifting to set to enhance his hunts, to sink into the shadows and protect coven mates. But most of the ache had faded. His fangs were usable if a bit short for properly sinking into something, and he and his friends had gotten coffee, pastry, and their UA letters. Tenya was sitting propped up against a tall tree, feet in the air. They had been aching after his training, and this was the best way to get them to recover. Hitoshi was up in the tree, draped over a branch and lazily humming to himself, not a full song but not unpowered either. Izuku was dangling from further along the branch, knees hooked over it and content to swing lightly in the breeze. It wasn't a high branch, so the fluff of his hair, starting to grow more, ready to be one of the signs few vampires could rid themselves of, was nearly in Tenya's face as he drifted. Eventually, the quiet got to be too much for Tenya and he shifted, pulling the letter, unopened, from his bag. Izuku held his own in front of his face, and Hitoshi paused his humming to extract his own from a pocket. They opened them at the same time. From all three, odd discs fell out. Hitoshi's and Izuku's both hit the ground, and Tenya dropped his in shock, so they all ended up roughly in a triangle beside Tenya when they activated. Greetings young Midoriya/Shinsu/A, boomed the holographic figure of All Might. Upon seeing who was presenting, all three shifted, eyes narrowing and all exhausted traces vanishing. You did very well on the written exam, scoring a 99/95/93, which is an outstanding pass. But that's not all. The practical exam resulted in a score of 32/31/48, which is a passing score. However, there is a secondary points system, rescue points. For your efforts to help your fellow test takers, as well as your efforts to work against the zero-pointer, you have been awarded 40/35/30 rescue points. He gestured to a scoreboard, showing Midoriya in 4th, under two people called Kirishima and Shiozaki, as well as Uraraka from the zero-pointer, Shinso in 8th, and Ida in 12th. The trio exchanged excited glances. Yes, you have all passed and done well. Welcome to your hero academia. The projections shut off, and for just a moment the clearing was full of silence. Then Hitoshi broke it, the young siren shrieking loud enough that Ida covered his ears and Izuku fell off of his branch. It wasn't far to fall, so he just rubbed his head and mock glared, but there was no heat behind it, so it took until Hitoshi ran out of air for him to stop. Izuku picked himself up, dusted himself off, and leaned up against Tenya. We all got in, he whispered, not fully comprehending it. 1. That all three managed to make it into one of the most competitive hero high school in the nation. 2. That All Might was involved enough that the secret of rescue points was told to him. Even the two who associated with heroes regularly didn't know about them, as Tensei had kept his acceptance letter out of the way of infant Tenya and Shoyuta, Hizashi, and Oboro had watched theirs alone in a group, like these three were doing now. Indeed we did. Shall we head back and let our guardians know? Asked Tenya, already stretching in preparation to get up and head back. His parents were going to be there via video conference, but Tensei was there, along with the Shinsis and the Aizawa Yamadas, plus Namuri was planning on showing up later that night once the Shinsis were more settled. The others had no objections, so Hitoshi dropped down onto Izuku, who simply shifted him to a more comfortable carrying position, and the three set off back to the Ida home where the three families would be waiting. Later that night, after the Shinsis had left and the adult Idas had hung up their call, the coven gathered in the rooftop trio's backyard around the fire pit. Izuku was sitting, while Namuri and Tensei settled onto the grass on either side of the path back to the house, and Shoyuta and Hizashi were messing with something inside the house. Eventually, they both came out, Hizashi with a box and Shoyuta with a tray. The moon was high in the sky and all the lights were out except for the crackling fire, occasionally sparked higher by Namuri and Tensei. Shoyuta was the first to speak, carefully placing the tray on the stone bench next to where Izuku was sitting. You're shifting and changing, and even though we're running through some of those as if you were a fledgling, you are still the oldest of us, so some things do need to be adapted for that. He paused, shifting some of the stuff on the tray, to pull out a long braided cord. The first quarter of it had small charms and gems attached to the braid, and it seemed at once achingly familiar and utterly unknown. This is your cord, a grounding item and a way to help keep track of memories beyond simply writing them down. It doesn't get taken, and you don't lose it because it stays with you at all times, but it's only worn openly among the community. He paused again, pulling a few small jars off of the tray, lining them up. It stays in your left shoulder, hidden in ink. Part of what the runes will help with until you're a full adult is hiding any ink from your development. These will help it sink in well and prevent scarring or discoloration. Shift please, while Hizashi does his own thing. Shoyuta went to work, carefully pouring the content of one bottle over the cord, making certain that it was fully soaked, then working a cream that smelt faintly of capsaicin into the skin of Izuku's left shoulder, just as he'd said. Meanwhile, Hizashi was lining up a set of small bottles as well as a single long needle. You're properly part of this coven now, and there are things to do to make this healthier. And official in a way that even an old one couldn't break. This includes some odd potions, and it won't be amazing but will be here the entire time and you'll know what you're drinking before you touch it. All right. Izuku nodded carefully, careful not to move his left shoulder, which Shoyuta was currently curling and winding the cord around. It was just hanging there, and Izuku felt that if he turned and looked, Shuta's eyes would be burning blue to keep it still and stable, his magic the one with the most immediate cost. Then Hisashi pulled his attention back by murmuring over the lines of vials, quietly pointing out which each one was. His shoulders started tingling, almost a full burn but without the heat he'd expected. Shoyuta stepped back, eyes their normal dark once more, and settled into a new position, hands on his newly inked shoulders to hold him in place. From what Hisashi had said, this was a good precaution. The first vial was sweet and rich, blood collected from all coven members, even those not there. That went down easily, and Izuku even tilted his head back to ensure he'd get all of it. The second vial was spicy, burning as it passed down, clearing him of all false bonds and breaking the last remnants of the bond he'd had with his sire. The third was minty and burning with cold, somehow not negating the heat from the second vial, preparing him to settle into the new bonds he'd form. Both adult vampires paused, drinking carefully of pre-taken blood from him, stating their intent to watch over him during his transition. The fourth tasted like emptiness and dust, building up his defenses, and the fifth tasted almost alive, supporting his strength. The sixth vial seemed full of the night sky, and was meant to bind his magic to the strength of the coven, ensuring that he'd be protected by and protective of his coven's spellwork. The seventh readied him for the changes wrought around him, and it filled every cell of his body with energy, crackling over and around and through him until he felt ready to burst, not fully connected to the world around him, dimly aware that he was limp and supported by the one behind him while the one in front raised the last three vials. The first tasted like nothing, but then hit hard, making him spasm from the sudden wave of pain. The second was an even harsher wave of pain, and all he could do was ride it out until it was but a dim echo, gone as soon as it had overtaken him. He sagged backwards, the only thing keeping his head from cracking open the support from behind him, and let his head fall backwards so he'd have to do less, then slowly settled back in his skin as the rich blood was tipped down his throat, securing his role in the coven properly. Izuku smiled. While still faint, he could feel the others' mental states, that they were proud of him for doing so well and ready to rest for a few hours. While certainly not the sleep that the humans had gone off for, rest was vital to most, if not all, sentient species, and while vampires did not need to sleep, it did not mean that they could not. The nest was safe and warm, and none of them needed to wake up early tomorrow. Life was about as good as it could be. It was a bright, clear day when Midoriya walked through the oversized halls of UA on his first day there as a student. He disliked it, pulling idly on his smoothie, tired from the vividity of the world around him, brought back into sharp contrast by the amount of light available. Eventually, he made it to the door of his classroom, 1A, and while the door was larger than it needed to be unless it was for those with gigantism quirks, it slid open easily when he pushed it. According to the seating chart, he was sitting in seat 18, right behind Shinso, trying to nap on the desk, and in front of a girl with purple hair cut in a sharp bob, chatting with a blonde boy with a black zigzag in one side of his hair. As he sat quietly, watching the rest of his class, both paused to introduce themselves. Bob girl was Jaira Kyoka, whose quirk was earphone jack, her ears extending into AUX cords and extendable. Blonde boy was Kaminari Denki, whose quirk was electrification, the production of up to 1.3 million volts of electricity, which could then be released. Midoriya was interested, a human taser, versatile enough to be able to work long distance as well as a short distance specialty, and told Kaminari so. The two were talking about the amount of electricity to pull off certain tricks when they were interrupted by the two halves of an argument, Ida and Bakugu, about whether the latter should have his feet on the desk and why. In the end, Ida had given up and was attempting to sit at his seat, in front of and to the right of Midoriya, but Bakugu hadn't given up, he rarely did. However, his rage had found a new target as he turned after Ida simply refused to acknowledge him, as he saw Midoriya sitting there. Deku, what do you think you're doing, showing up here as if you could manage to be a half-decent hero, not with your worthless quirk, if you even have one? He looked ready to either continue shouting or set off yet another explosion, possibly even in Midoriya's face, while others around him looked ready to jump in, defending their friend Shirnu, tired but having given up on his nap or holding back the clearly unstable firecracker. A redhead with spiky hair seems ready to grab him and keep him away from their classmate, when something changed at the front of the classmate. Most fell silent at the unspoken signal, pulling back and shifting to see what was wrong, although Bakugu simply snarled until the figure now standing at the front of the classroom. It took most of you 20 seconds from when I walked in to fall silent. You will need to be better. Heroics is demanding and you'll need to put in a lot of work to survive. He paused, looking at the shocked faces. My name is Aizawa Shoyuda, and I'll be your homeroom teacher for the year. Put these on. He tossed a gym uniform onto Kaminari's desk, and meet me in the training fields outside. Most of the class did so quickly, although their efforts were slightly hampered by the fact that none of them knew where the locker rooms or the training fields were. However, despite their difficulties, most of them had made it out to the field within 10 minutes, and the remaining few were only a minute behind. Aizawa was waiting, checking the time on his phone almost absently. We'll be working on that time as well, but you're all here. Now, he gestured to the field and the marked areas, you're going to run a quirk assessment test. The education department is behind, not allowing you to use quirks in standardized assessment tests, so I'll have to gather the data myself. The tests we're running today in order: 100-meter sprint, push-ups, sit-ups, side steps, grip strength, pull-ups, endurance run, and ball throw. You are permitted and encouraged to use your quirks to enhance your scores. The announcement sent the class into a tizzy. Uraraka seemed excited to show what she could do, although she also looked a little nervous, while another pink-haired student cheered about how fun it would be. This was, to Izuku's mind, a very big mistake. Fun. Aizawa's voice cut through the excited chatter. You think this is fun, a game? Then the one whose score is least is getting expelled. Uraraka frowned. That's not fair, she protested. Life isn't fair, and heroics especially isn't. You will be dealing with natural disasters, robberies, murders, and other crimes. I am here to prepare you for the work, and if you do not have the potential, the ability for me to work with you and get you up to standard, then you will not be attending here. Aizawa looked as if he was going to say more, then sighed. Uraraka, you got first in the exam. He would have said more, but Bakugu exploded at her. How? I should have been first. No way you could have beat my score. Round cheeks. Aizawa pulled him back with his capture scarf, eyes glowing red. Bakugu, restrain yourself. Do not attack your classmates, and stop trying to use your quirk. It's giving me dry eye, but it's not going to do anything. Bakugu stopped fighting, one eye twitching but willing to put up with the rules for now. Aizawa held him there for a few more seconds, then unraveled the scarf and pushed him back to his previous spot. You've got one strike now. Uraraka, what was your average ball throw in middle school? About 49 meters, sensei, but that was with bulky gloves since they didn't trust mine. She responded, confused but willing to roll with things. Acceptable if harsh. Throw this. He tossed a metallic ball to her, while using your quirk, and we'll see what your score is. Uraraka tapped the fingers of one hand to the ball, and a small flash of pink light lit up the ball before she lightly tossed the ball underhand. The ball drifted upwards, quickly fading from view. Eventually, Aizawa's phone beeped and he looked at Uraraka. You can release it if you want, but we're probably not getting it back. He lifted his phone, which simply read infinity. For that, we've got to deduct a few points, but still a good score. And with that, the rest of the events began. Izuku was fairly confident. He could outperform most in some things, but hadn't ever got first. Even the straight physical events, the push-ups, the sit-ups, the pull-ups, he didn't come in first, although that was more of a longing to stay unseen than actual aptitude. Being dead had a few benefits, and he hadn't needed to have his heart beating yet. Most of his attention was on his classmates. Tenya and Hitoshi were doing well for themselves with the boost in leg strength and breath control respectively, keeping them well on the upper middle side of the pack. Finally, after the last few shuji, 6 arms that could sprout extra limbs, possible history with the community but unlikely finished the ball throw, the class gathered together to see the rankings. Izuku's name was in third, under Yaoyorozu creating things, likely from a bodily resource, no history with the community but powerful family and support, who came in first, and Todoroki record spoke of fire and ice, but he only used ice. Look for problems related to that. He looked like Yukimura Rei, if so, definitely connected to the community, who was only a few points above him. Tenya came in 5th, a very comfortable score for somebody who didn't have advantages in several tests, while Hitoshi came in 7th, very good for someone with a mental quirk. Bakugo came in 8th by a noticeable margin, and once more he exploded, this time at Hitoshi and Izuku, who were standing next to each other. Deku, purple freak. How'd you score higher than me? I beat you in some of those. Once more he was pulled back and his quirk erased, and once more he struggled against the capture scarf for a few seconds before falling silent. Bakugo, I believe I warned you about attacking your classmates, 2 strikes now. And you were also warned that damaging the equipment would lead to a reduced score, and yet you continued to let off explosions next to or on the equipment. While your potential is not 0, it is rapidly approaching such. Aizawa turned to the lowest scorer, Hagakure, who was invisible and seemed slight from how the uniform seemed to fit her, and grinned, wide and half-feral, although his fangs were carefully out of sight. And as for you? Hagakure trembled. It was a logical ruse to make you do your best. Nobody is getting expelled. Return to the class and pick up the packets on your desk, then you can go home. Make sure you go through them. They contain maps, rules, and the second round of permission forms, including a new set for the dorms which are currently being built. The class scattered, first back to the locker rooms, then to the classroom to pick up the packets, and then out the gates with the rest of the school. Izuku hurried out, wanting to get a nap and so he could go out during the night. He hadn't during the week of anxiety and some of the street kids were likely to be hungry. He was so focused he nearly missed Tenya catching him, so they could walk to the train together, and Hitoshi joined them after a quick detour to pick up vending machine coffee. His actual quirk, not the one registered, was that he only needed 2 hours of sleep to function a night, but that often meant he only got 2 hours of sleep a night, especially when anxious, and went through his days more tired than he should have been. It had been a successful night, with several of the street kids Izuku fed glad to see him. Most of them were on the younger side of things and an extra meal was the difference between another cold corpse in an alley and a living, if skinny, kid running around. However, some were his age or older, whether they couldn't get to a shelter dobby. All those burns meant that he tried to stay low-key and most shelter workers would have turned him aside for fighting, couldn't handle being at a shelter twice. A mental split had him babbling against himself and often led to fights if people weren't prepared or simply needed different dietary needs. Toga Himiko needed a bit of blood most days to stay sane and blood banks only went so far. Wasn't a proper vampire. A half-breed but one of the stable ones, especially if you couldn't get far. He could bring them food and a little treatment and so he did. But his second day at UA was dawning, far too bright in his opinion, and so he had to go back to pick up his uniform and backpack. Most of the classes were introductions, meeting the teacher and getting the syllabi for each class, history, English, math, science, law and ethics, but after lunch, the teacher that entered was All Might and he ran his class differently. I am here walking through the door like a normal person, he boomed, striding through the door. The class exploded in chatter, although a few remained silent. Todoroki, who hadn't spoken beyond his name and a few direct answers to questions. Tokoyami, who stayed fairly quiet, Jairu, who was wincing against the noise, Izuku, Tenya, and Hitoshi, not ones to chatter in front of teachers and not fans of the man, but most of the class was happy to chatter until All Might pulled out a card, held up away from the class. Welcome. I am teaching Foundational Heroics. Our activity today will be, he turned the card around to read in red, battle trials. But first, what is the most important part of heroics? A low murmur filled the class, but before anyone could answer, All Might did so for them. Looking good. He pulled out a remote and tapped a button, letting costume cases eject from the walls. Meet me in ground beta in 20 minutes. And so saying, he turned and headed out the classroom just as fast as he had entered. Most of the class hurried after him, a few lagging behind to make sure their stuff was tucked away safely. The locker rooms were filled with chatter and the boys showing off the parts of their costumes they liked, although Izuku could already see some issues with them. Kirishima had an open chest, which seemed like he was asking to be shot. Aoyama had a long cape, perfect for getting tangled, and when he exited the locker room, there were other issues. Tokoyami was joining the poorly caped crew, although his had somewhat of a use hiding dark shadow. Hagakure had only gloves and boots, neither of which actually protected her or let her teammates see her. Yaoyorozu had less covering her than really should have been allowed, and the shelf and book on her back seemed poorly designed. But they weren't his costumes, and they would probably find out the faults in them soon enough. All Might fumbled through a basic explanation of the lesson: paired in twos, combat in a building, hero/villain teams decided randomly, and dealing with a nuclear bomb. Midoriya found himself on a team with Uraraka, the nice girl from the entrance exam, against Bakugo and Tenya. He knew how to deal with Bakugo, as he was angry enough to override what good sense he had and hunt him down, while Tenya was smart enough that he'd do what he needed to do. Despite being more of a mobility-based fighter, he'd likely end up guarding the bomb. Uraraka smiled at him as they circled the building the villains had holed up in. "Do you have any plans to deal with them, Mito?" she asked, frowning up at the building. It wasn't the tallest one there, only 5 stories, but they couldn't go in until the planning time was up. Midoriya shrugged. "Well, Bakugo, the explodey one, will likely come after me, so I can pull him aside from the bottom, and Ida will have to stay with the bomb. He's very fast, but not incredible at close-quarters combat and is unlikely to pull something unconventional in here, especially something loud and flashy. And Mito?" Uraraka shrugged. "You're green, and you seem nice. Deku sounds mean, but there's nothing else I can really call you. So I'll go in through the top and work my way down, and you'll go in from the bottom and keep Bakugo away from the fight." She paused, tapping another rock to join the small cloud floating around her head. "At least I'll have ammo to distract Ida." Midoriya nodded at that, but his comment was cut off by All Might declaring through the PA system, "Time is up. Hero team may enter the building." The pair exchanged looks and split up, Uraraka tapping herself and pressing her palms to the wall to help guide herself up, while Midoriya walked in through the front doors. The lobby was dark and bare, UA's large budget not extending to the furnishings of an office building for destructive first years. Old habit had him stepping quietly, but he paused, shifting his feet to plant more firmly and make noise. Bakugo would expect him down here, but he did need to play the part of lure to keep Uraraka as unburnt as possible. And soon his role was fulfilled, as Bakugo burst through the doors, leaving them charred and smoking, swinging loosely on their hinges. "Idiot! What did you do to get in?" he shouted, explosions already lighting up his palms. "You don't deserve to be here, Deku." Midoriya rolled his shoulders and shifted. His jumpsuit was a little snugger than he'd like it to be, and he'd be taking a needle to it soon enough, but it was good enough for his task. "I got in the same way you did, Bakugo. Passing the entrance exam. And if I managed that, then by definition I deserve to be here, despite all your claims to the contrary. Which one of us is on thin ice again?" Bakugo roared and charged, but Midoriya was already sprinting for the stairs. This was a waiting game, and he had a timer on his watch set for the end of the match. A quick glance told him he had 5 minutes left, plenty of time to lead Bakugo on a wild goose chase over the lower floors. He bounced off of walls, hid behind blind corners to smack Bakugo in the ribs with an Eskrima stick before sprinting off again, and even jumped out a window to swing down another floor. Time almost seemed to be stretching on, but he could never quite shake Bakugo. It was like he was getting directions or something, but that would be cheating. A quick glance at his watch showed him that he only had seconds left, which was good since Bakugo was gaining and he was running out of room to maneuver without causing permanent damage. His heart wasn't beating, but Uraraka's updates required him to breathe to respond, and his breath was coming shorter and shorter. Even Yamada hadn't chased him down this closely, preferring to keep a larger distance so he wouldn't lose an eye to a knife. Finally, Midoriya ended up backed into a corner. There were windows, but they were shut and Bakugo was too close to unlock one. They looked thick too, so he'd have to be harsh to break them. He shifted lightly, angling as subtly as he could towards the window that looked thinnest and closest, as Bakugo stalked forwards. "Finally caught up to you, Deku. Still running from a fight you can't win?" He continued stalking forwards, while Midoriya surreptitiously checked his watch. The match was 4 minutes overtime, and his train of thought was cut off as Bakugo continued. "Care to see these beauties?" He stuck his grenade-shaped gauntlets forwards, twisting them in the dim light. They capture and contain my sweat, allowing me to produce a bigger explosion. What do you think will happen if I set one of these off in here? Midoriya continued edging towards the window. 3 long seconds passed, then All Might spoke through the PA. Bakugo, don't. He could die. Bakugo cackled. Not if he dodges. So saying, he set off his gauntlets and let the explosion fill the room. Izuku groaned in Recovery Girl's ward, next to several of his other classmates, although he was visually the worst off. Recovery Girl was fuming, and Aizawa was standing in the corner, looking ready to murder. Most of the injured students were unconscious, while Izuku sat, slurping up one of the blood packs Recovery Girl kept for transfusions or hungry vampires. It wasn't a big pack, as the beginning of the school year and the incidents meant that Recovery Girl's stock was lower than normal, but it was enough to deal with the burns. So go over what your exercise was like for the recording, problem child, and then we'll let the others in to tell their sides. Aizawa was irritated not only at the blonde fool who taught the wrong class, but also at the fact that almost half the class was injured, and with one exception, it was those with villainous, weaker, or mutant quirks. Todoroki was also lying in a warm bath, thawing from nearly giving himself hypothermia. Izuku drained the last of the pouch and settled. So we got our costumes, got changed, headed out to ground beta, got introduced to the exercise pair versus pair inside fighting, quirks allowed, hero versus villain secondary objective, and a time constraint leading to a villain victory. I was paired with Uraraka against Ida and Bakugo. We split up at the beginning of the allotted time as announced. I started a timer, Uraraka went high to try and find the bomb and fight Ida. Don't know what happened beyond the fact that she made it to the bomb room and was fighting Ida, 'cause the mic cut out after that. I was luring away Bakugo, spent most of the time trying to outrun him. Never could quite manage it, it was like somebody was telling him where I was going. Got me in a corner with non-immediate escape routes, monologued a bit, went to set off his arm cannons, tried to get him to stop. He confirmed that it would be lethal if I didn't dodge, set them off. I jumped out a window but still got caught by the edges. He got out okay, although he destabilized the wreckage further to get out. To know about Ida and Uraraka. Turned out to be first and second degree burns, would have been worse but for the distance and the fact that my jumpsuit was meant to take a lot of damage. Aizawa nodded. We've got your story, as well as Ida's and Uraraka's, to confirm that Uraraka got the bomb several times but victory was not declared. In fact, after they got out of the wreckage, All Might tried to declare a villain victory, but was shouted down by the class. Now, your friends are anxious to see you, so I'll let them in. As he stood, he tugged the curtains closed around the still unconscious parts of the class, as well as another so that Recovery Girl couldn't directly see the bed. Tenya came hurrying through, perching on the bed across from him, twitching slightly as if he wanted to reach forwards, but didn't, likely due to Uraraka standing next to the bed as well. Mido, glad to see you're up and moving. I got the bomb, but All Might didn't call it, and so many of the other fights turned out wrong too, whether not calling the time or giving help to one team, and now so many people are hurt. It wasn't too bad, a lot of people pulled back as soon as they realized what was happening, but still. She paused, then twitched slightly as her phone pinged. I'm glad to see you're all right, but I have to go now if I want to catch my train. See you tomorrow. Uraraka hurried out, throwing sad and worried looks over her shoulder as she darted to her train. As soon as she was firmly down the hall, Tenya leaned forwards, poking at Izuku a few times, then hugging him. I'm glad to see you are doing better, Izuku, he whispered, shaking slightly. Izuku winced slightly as the contact pulled at half-healed burns, but hugged his friend back. Eventually, Tenya pulled away and shifted on the bed. The class is turning against All Might as he showed clear bias. Nobody walked out of that class on his side, and I doubt Bakugo is remaining in the hero course after the stunt he pulled, he explained. Uraraka and Yaoyorozu are assembling a list of complaints, and Yaoyorozu and I, along with Satu volunteering his services, are planning to bring gift baskets for those injured. Izuku poked him. Tenya, while this is nice, and I'm glad you're finding ways to help, and that man isn't remaining popular, you're stalling. What did you want to tell me? Tenya took a deep breath and shifted again, tilting his head away from Izuku. You're still injured, and you look hungry. Take a drink, take what you need, and then we can start studying, or, if you'd rather work later, we can at least put together a way to help keep him out of classes as much as possible. Izuku froze. This was a big offer, especially since the Idas were hunters. The parental Idas were known in the community as figures to avoid, as they were quite prolific, and had shifted away from hero work as their eldest took over the family agency to spend more time hunting. Tensei had become blood-bound to their coven, but Tenya had remained undecided for all the time Izuku had known him. His fangs lowered, but he needed to be certain. Are you sure about this, Tenya? He nodded, certainty in his eyes. You need it, and the discrimination All Might perpetuates has made it easier for my parents to do their work. I want to stay away from that, and you are my friend. Izuku nodded. Let me know if anything hurts or you need me to stop. Carefully, he took Tenya's head in his hands, shifting closer and tilting it to expose the large vein. He liked the site where he'd bite, carefully making sure to cover the full surface so Tenya wouldn't get an infection or feel much pain, then sank his fangs in. He pulled and the flavor burst. Rich and vivid, with faint traces of citrus, motor oil, and metal. It was far more vivid than he'd had in long decades, and almost too soon he pulled away. Tenya's eyes were dilated, and he slumped across Izuku as he leaned back. Izuku ran his fingers through Tenya's thick blue hair, admiring the color, so unlike what he'd grown up with, as Tenya processed the venom and clear skin spread across the burns. Eventually, he sat up. I see why Tensei described it as a trip. I don't think I'll ever feel something quite like that, he commented, still a little wobbly from the blood loss but more stable. And I see why people could get addicted to it. Izuku shook his head. You don't get addicted unless somebody's trying to do it. The soreness will set in about 15 minutes, and that's usually enough to counteract the pleasure. Now, let's get you some orange juice and a muffin, and we ought to be getting home. It'll heal fine, you'll be fine in a few hours, and theoretically if I needed to I could feed in 5 days. Tenya nodded, and the two boys set off for food and home, ready to study and plan. The warm afternoon sun and the flowering trees made for an appealing, quiet walk as the two discussed the current heroics legislation as related to mutations. Aizawa was standing at the front of the class, yellow sleeping bag discarded behind his podium, and was ready to make an announcement. The 20 students of Class 1A were nervously waiting. The upperclassmen had been generous in their tales of Aizawa's past classes, including the fact that Class 2A was made up of a few transfer students from Gen Ed, the two who had managed to earn re-enrollment, and students from the former 1B. The silence was broken by the bell, and Aizawa straightened, pocketing his phone. There are several announcements to make today, so listen well, Hellions. The first, Bakugo Katsuki. Silence fell. Even Kirishima, the friendliest one in the class, hadn't wanted to get close to him, and had barely made it out of his first attempt to get his number that morning with his uniform intact. With his hardening quirk, he hadn't had to worry about the explosions, but it was still startling that his first response to irritation was to attempt to blow up his classmate. The only one not looking nervous or tense was Bakugo himself, sprawled defiantly at his desk, eyes lidded like he'd been napping. Yeah, teach? He drawled, refusing to give any more respect than he had to. Aizawa's expression didn't change. You've been expelled. Bakugo exploded, bolting upright and shouting. What? You can't expel me, I'm the Dash. Sighing, Aizawa glared, eyes glowing red and hair lifting almost perfunctorily. You have been expelled from the hero course for repeated refusal to stop using your quirk when not in a training situation, repeated hostile quirk use on your classmates when not in a training situation, refusal to listen to authority, and repeated distaste for the lives of your classmates not directly connected to aforementioned situations. You will be in the general education course until the sports festival in a month. If by then you have changed and you make a good showing, then you may earn a seat in the hero course once more. If you continue on this path, however, you will not be participating in the sports festival and be expelled. In addition, Nizu has other terms to ensure the safety of your new classmates. Go to his office, where the rest of the terms will be discussed. Bakugo seemed like the wind had been taken out of his sails. The capture weapon wrapped around his shoulders and gently pushed him out the classroom, shutting the door behind him. Aizawa turned back to the class, suddenly looking a lot more tired. "Oh, now that that's dealt with, your class is yesterday, specifically All Might's Foundational Heroics class." The tension, which had ebbed as Bakugo was steered out of the class, sparked back into full force. It was not supposed to happen, and we apologize for the disaster that it turned into. He stretched, frowned at the surprised looks on a few faces, and continued. Any class where over half the students end up with Recovery Girl for more than a quick icing is absolutely a disaster. But that's not the issue here. First, that wasn't the planned class. Yesterday was meant to be an overview of what the class was meant to teach and going over safety procedures. We'll be doing that tomorrow, as today's can't be rescheduled, but what you'll need to know is not to be an idiot, and if you use a weapon or anything that serves as a weapon, it is to be treated as if it is live the entire time. All Might was meant to have been teaching the third-year class, which met an hour later. Imagine my surprise when I found the classroom empty, the costumes missing, and a message from Nizu that I needed to cover the third years, who were getting anxious and sparking out. By the time that was dealt with, I assumed a sub had been found and didn't investigate further until Recovery Girl sent me a message. That is my fault, and for that I apologize. All Might has been placed on probation from teaching, and we are ensuring that the teacher he is meant to be working with is keeping a better eye on him so that something like this does not happen. For future knowledge, if he comes in ready to lead a class, please inform him that this is not the third-year class he is meant to be teaching and that your teachers will be there soon. Aizawa sighed, moving back behind his podium. That was a mess, and now to today's announcements. First, the entire afternoon will be a form of foundational heroics. Midnight will be giving an overview of the purpose behind costumes and what the laws are for you as minors, including your support gear. She, Present Mike, and Ectoplasm will be helping you run through exercises to get used to your costumes, as well as filing for any changes you wish to make, and you will be making changes either cosmetically or practically. Meanwhile, I will be pulling you aside for a quick quirk counseling session to correct the information your quirk counselors gave you and work out your exercise plan to get you well-rounded. Each session should last 15 minutes maximum, so afternoon classes are starting earlier than normal. You'll be taking the first lunch block today. He paused, slurped down half a pouch, then stepped off to the side. And for the rest of homeroom, I have a task for you. Chatter filled the classroom, the tension mostly gone with the plans and the apologies, and eventually Aizawa glared, red eyes gleaming bright, to get them to be quiet. You need to elect class president and vice president. I don't care how you do so, the only rules are that it's somewhat fair and anyone who says they don't want to will not be chosen. He tucked himself back in his sleeping bag as the class exploded into chatter. Eventually, Azui managed to get them to agree on an election, and Ida passed around a box for people to put their votes in. He wrote names on the board as they came up, marking next to names when they got multiple votes, then stood back. Yayarozu had been voted class president, and Ida, with the second most votes, was vice president. Yayarozu seemed shocked but pleased, willingly accepting the role and collecting numbers so she could send out reminders. Ida, too, seemed happy. At least somebody could see that he liked knowing what was going on and making sure people followed the rules. Morning classes went as normal, although they caught Present Mike glaring out the windows at the still-gathered press occasionally. As the bell for lunch rang, he called, "Midoriya, Shinso, stay after for a minute." The two exchanged looks, but obediently remained, Midoriya stretching over Shinsu's shoulder to see if there was something the taller could see that would explain it. There was nothing. Mike finished up his paperwork and glanced up. "Alright, now that that's done. We didn't get the two of you checked in at the gate. Is there something we need to worry about with security?" Izuku and Hitoshi exchanged looks, then Hitoshi started shaking with laughter. "Nah, there's nothing." He dissolved into giggles. Izuku smacked him, then shook his head at Mick's questioning look. "Hitoshi's right, I carried him over the wall while he hummed at the reporters not to pay attention to us. Unless you and Itezawa-sensei are planning on doing something similar, UA should be fine." Mike laughed. "That sounds about right. Now, you two need lunch, or Hitoshi does, at least." "Izuku, lunch rush hasn't gotten the menu changes in yet. There's enough other changes and a mess-up in shipping that it's likely just gotten lost in paperwork." "Shoaizawa left you a pouch?" That'll get you through training, but we expect a proper dinner afterwards. Izuku nodded, gave a thumbs up to confirm he knew the plans, and headed out the door with Hitoshi. They split up, Izuku for the pouch that would be tucked in his gym locker, Hitoshi for the cafeteria. Draining the pouch, a full one of blood, likely cows from the taste, and starting on a second he'd stolen sometime earlier that week, strawberry, Izuku wandered through the halls. The pouch was high-calorie, so it was taking the edge off of the still human hunger, but the workout and carrying Hitoshi, plus the previous day, meant that if he wanted to keep his control around his classmates, none of which would be on the defensive and all pressing forwards, bringing all that fresh vital blood to the surface, he wasn't going to test himself by heading into the cafeteria, already full of people and where tempers were often rising high. The hallways at first glance seemed wide and clear. At second glance, they seemed nonsense. But at the third glance, you could see how defensible it was, how easily a handful of people could hold off a much larger force, how much room there was so that even if something was taken, it could be retaken by a force that knew the tricks. Nizu was, as always, planning ahead, perhaps old memories, perhaps. He cut himself off. Something smelt wrong, of rot and decay halted a little too late, a dusty room that's just had its windows thrown open, a faint hint of a sweet musty scent like an old library or a rare books collection overlaid with that sickly sweet rot. Both seemed familiar, but as he tried to get one, he got tangled up in the other. Following the trail, he found it led to a document storage room. Something whispered on the other side of the door, Ozone maybe? Something that sang of home, but the door was locked and he hadn't brought his picks to school. Either way, Nizu needed to hear about this, and so did Shoyuta and Hisashi. The class gathered at the steps, waiting for 13 to finish talking to Aizawa-sensei. Apparently, there had been a slight mix-up in the scheduling, and All Might, who had been supposed to be giving a lecture on the importance of rescue heroics in all aspects of the heroic curriculum, had instead chosen not to show up at all. He wasn't sick or injured, as the news that morning had shown that he'd interfered in 3 crimes that morning, although, Ida had pointed out, there were several other heroes on the scene as well, and he'd recognized one of them as a Team I-Dayton partner, and if All Might had interrupted their case he might have pushed back the breaking of a drag ring by weeks. The class was honestly glad he was gone, even the ones he'd favored, and bent the rules for had still been pushed harder than they should have been, hence Todoroki's near hypothermia. About a third of the class was in their gym uniforms, as they'd be running a brief overview of all the zones and some of them weren't fully comfortable in their costumes or they hadn't been redesigned yet. Hagakure was bouncing LEDs in her costume tracing the outlines of her arms and legs, shifting colors as she turned and continued showing off how well it worked to an admiring Ishido and Aoyama. Finally, the teachers finished their discussion, only a few sets of keen ears could hear that it was mutual complaining, and turned back to the class. 13 shifted to the front, Aizawa pacing around the class to make sure they all stayed in one place, and started their lecture. Welcome to the Universal Simulations Joint, designed and partially built by me. I'm 13, the space hero, and I will be your rescue instructor for today's drills. Before we begin, I have a few points to make. You know my quirk, black hole? Uraraka bounced up and down. You use it to help remove debris or pull unstable rubble back, and it's even got uses in pulling people back towards you. 13 seemed to smile under their thick spacesuit. I use it to help and I'd like to think I do so well. But it can easily kill too, and so can all of yours. Midoriya shivered. He knew that well, just because he was gifted with his magic didn't mean that he hadn't had a steep learning curve, and Yamada had nearly lost a hand when he was helping him relearn his boundaries. Aizawa's quirk apprehension test taught you that your quirks have many applications, and All Might's battle trials, the air quotes were almost visible due to 13's scorn, taught you that your quirks can be weapons in ways. My training is here to show you that not only can they help, but that they can also harm if used in the wrong circumstances. They turned, looking over the plaza to the various zones. So we'll start with going over the general dash. Something was happening in the plaza. Purple sparks were forming, spreading, until a large portal formed and spat out 2 people and a shambling monster thing. The shorter of the pair was covered in severed hands, while the taller was in a suit, had a high collar around what would have been its neck, and looked to be entirely made of purple mist in the vague shape of a person. More portals formed across the entirety of the USJ, dropping people everywhere. Soon, there was a small crowd of villains, for that is what they were, in the plaza, and more in the zones. Kaminari screamed, one hand going to his ear, and the class bunched together. Some pushed themselves to the outside, Kirishima, with his hardening skin, Aoyama, with his naval laser, and Ida, with his speed and kicks, but others pressed closer together, trying to make a smaller target and terrified. The hand-covered one spoke. "Where is All Might? He was supposed to be here." He frowned, twitching and jerking slightly, then continued. "The League of Villains is here, however, and the boss will show up soon enough. That's how it works." Aizawa frowned, pulling his goggles up to cover his eyes. "Ida, run for assistance. Tell whoever you can find that the USJ has been breached. Kaminari, try to get a signal through. The more noise we can make, the better. The rest of you stay together. I'll be dealing with the ones in the plaza." He flashed a few quiet hand signals at Midoriya and Shinso while Ida shifted through the mass of classmates to where he had a straight shot for the doors. The signals read, "Keep them together, get them safe. Permission to defend if needed." Then he leaped down the stairs, capture scarf spiraling out as he landed on the closest thug and sprang off, fully immersed in the fray. Ida bolted for it as the rest of the class continued shifting, making sure that the other long-ranged fighters had space to work while the close-quarters ones had reached for the few stragglers that had broken past Aizawa, and the non-combatants shifted to where they'd be most useful. The hand-covered one continued pacing. "Why isn't All Might here? We were here to kill him and destroy his image." Jiraiya paused, looked down at him, and called, "If you were killing him, I wouldn't get in your way, but he's not meant to be around the first-year class at all, so I don't know why you came here of all places." There were several calls of agreement from the rest of the class, including one notable, "If you get him down, can we get a few hits in?" from Yukimura, who had been breaking up the ice path he'd made so Ida could get a faster start out the door. The hand man looked confused, but the mist man put what would have been a hand on his shoulder. "Shigaraki Tamura, if the students all claim to dislike him, they would not summon him. He is unlikely to appear, perhaps we should dash." But he was cut off. "Kurojirai, doesn't matter. Maybe they see the truth here, but they're still heroes." The scorn dripped from his voice like poison. "And if we hurt the baby heroes, then perhaps All Might will finally come calling." Kurojirai nodded, and purple portals began forming around the class. As they scattered to avoid one, they kept being herded into another. Midoriya ducked and dodged too, but stumbled over a loose chunk of ice from Yukimura's attempts to avoid getting Sekid into another one and fell into a third. He found himself falling into water, angling himself to hit cleanly. A villain had swum next to him, but before they could do more than snarl threateningly, a thick wet cord wrapped itself around his waist and pulled him out of the water and onto the boat. It was Azuitsu's tongue. She was perched on the boat next to a slicked-down Hitoshi. He was also soaked, but he and his costume were better suited to water, and he looked smug at the fact that Izuku's hair was puffing out as it dried. Tsu nodded at him, unraveling her tongue. "So you can form pockets, anything in there to help get us off of here, Karo?" Izuku shrugged, trying to remember what he'd stocked up on for UA and what was already in there and he just hadn't removed. There was an inflatable raft, but he was pretty sure it had a hole in it, and even if it didn't, why would a 15-year-old have a fully inflated inflatable raft? So he shook his head, but a thought struck him. "Tsu, how far can you jump?" She eyeballed the gap. "Around 30 meters, Karo. I can probably carry one of you and still make it, but not both, Karo." Hitoshi shrugged. "Then I'll just get the villains to gather on the far side and swim across." He turned and strode to the lowest point on the deck, humming as he went, while Tsu frowned. "I know his quirk is powerful, Karo, but will he get all of them?" Izuku smiled, careful to keep his lips together to hide the fact that his fangs had descended from the adrenaline, and nodded. "Careful not to open his mouth too much," he confirmed. "Hitoshi can manage, but he won't need to worry as much if we're far away. Where do you want to jump from?" Though Tsu still looked worried, she led him to her jumping point and wrapped her tongue around him in an improvised HRSIS. Counting back from 3, the pair jumped. Izuku felt the wind ruffle his hair as they flew, landing neatly and securely on the ground, and turned to see Hitoshi dive smoothly from the boat and slice through the water that was now empty of villains but for the deepest, furthest part. It was a matter of seconds for Hitoshi to reach them, and they headed back to the plaza. Aizawa had mostly cleared the plaza when they returned, and they saw that most of their classmates had made it back as well. Tsu crept around and headed towards the enclave they had made, tucked behind some fallen rocks and large trees, but Izuku and Hitoshi had their eyes on the fight. Aizawa hadn't slowed down, but he did seem to be tiring. The magic that interrupted quirks and curses alike had a drawback, as all strong magic did, and his price was a dry heat near his eyes. The goggles were meant to counter the effect, but he was still an ambush fighter for a reason. The goggles could only work for so long. The two leading villains, Kurogyari and Shigaraki, were standing back from the fight, both looking like something was wrong. Kurogyari's mist was swirling, and at times it looked like it was going to form a human body, and at times it looked like it was going to drift apart. The occasional flash of vivid blue in the otherwise dark purple fog spoke of shock, and the collar seemed to be snapped in places and was sparking ominously. Meanwhile, Shigaraki seemed to be twitching, whispering to himself, almost jerking with how big the changes seemed to be. Carefully, Hitoshi scrambled up into the canopy and started hopping from tree to tree. When he judged he'd made far enough, he settled in the split between three branches, well hidden, but easily heard, and watched, waiting to see what would happen. Shigaraki was tugging at his hair, keening lowly, but eventually straightened and shouted, voice raspier and almost breaking, "Nomu! Get rid of him!" The shambling mass of flesh lunged for Shoyuta, and Izuku jumped at it. 1, 2, 3 knives buried deep near its spine and then bouncing off to land near Shoyuta. For once he was glad his coat hadn't been finished yet. Shoyuta flexed his fingers, nails lengthening into claws, as Izuku shifted, half in front of him, guarding a perceived weakness, but ready to spring, fangs first, just as Shoyuta was. Hizashi whispered down the coven bond, feelings of near, of luck on your hunt, of worry, injury? Pulsing and stinging them both with the faint prickle as he slowly got nearer. Still several minutes out, but reinforcements were coming. Shoyuta and Izuku exchanged looks as the knives slowly fell out of the Nomu's skin, bright red blood welling up for a moment as the wound sealed. This changed things, but they knew how to deal with this. On the other side of the clearing, the faint strains of Hitoshi's song echoed, and Shoyuta could see over the Nomu's shoulder that Shigaraki was calmer, less tense, while Kurogyari seemed to be pulling into himself, fog almost tight enough to pull away in places. Izuku lunged at the Nomu, tearing out a chunk of flesh, and Shoyuta turned and ran towards a stand of trees that looked sturdy enough to hold what they were planning. The Nomu managed to pin Izuku, and that was Shuta's cue to take his own chunk out of the Nomu's side. He paused, swallowed the thick blood, laced with something, not poisonous but not like normal blood either, and bolted again. He and Izuku traded off tearing chunks from the Nomu, leading it towards the trees. Finally, they darted in together and tore the fresh meat off of the front half of its neck, letting it slump forwards and try to stem the gush of blood that fell. The pair made it to the stand of trees, and Izuku slashed open a pocket, tossing a length of heavy chain to Shoyuta. They strung a few more lengths up, then turned and headed back in front of the stand. The Nomu was mad, and charged at them, fast and determined like the predator it was. But what it wasn't was smart. So Shoyuta and Izuku dodged to the side just as it reached them, each tearing one more strip of flesh down its sides as it tripped over the first chain and sprang the trap, the next links falling over it. Shoyuta and Izuku threw a few more strands of chain over it, pinning it to the ground by the initial chains that it had healed over. While it still strained, it was being held down enough that they could actually look it over. Shoyuta moved, drawing a long knife ready to sever the brain stem, when a loud noise rang through the doors slamming open, and All Might declaring loudly, "Never fear, for I am here." All Might leaped across the USJ as other teachers spilled through after him. Snipe and Ectoplasm started rounding up the villains and herding them out to the police. Mike collected the students from their improvised fortress and threw a large punch at the Nomu. It did little damage, but snapped the chains that were embedded into its sides. It came up roaring, and threw Izuku halfway to the wall. Shoyuta dodged the first hit, but it still glanced off him and threw him off balance, and as he threw his knife at the Nomu's brainstem, he got caught by All Might's next punch and got thrown the same way as Izuku, slamming into the domed ceiling and thudding into the ground, only luck keeping him from landing headfirst. Still, his ankle snapped cleanly, and several ribs had clearly been broken from one of the impacts. Izuku stumbled to his feet, shifting carefully so that his own broken ribs wouldn't puncture a lung. He hadn't been able to stop his heart beating in time to deal, and then forgotten in the thrill of the fight, and at this point it was more important that he heal completely than quickly. He was already feeling better than he would have, the blood from the Nomu doing its job and strengthening him, but the twin impacts hadn't done him any favors. Still, he made it to Shoyuta and helped him stand and stumble back to the teachers. Mike had made sure the students were safe, and was now dealing with the leader villains. Shigaraki had passed out, and reeked of thraldom. He was tagged to Tsukachi, who could deal with the problem, as he was more prepared to dispense justice while still accommodating for the toxic thraldom. Kurojuri was a different story, slumped on the ground, weakly clawing at the still sparking collar. He glanced up and wheezed, "Help," before being cut off by an especially strong cluster of sparks. Shrugging, Mike looked over the collar and found a seam near the break. Carefully, he pulled at it and felt it split, and pulled it back to find runes clustered around the rim. He stared. Those runes reeked of the same toxicity that surrounded the enthralled Shigaraki, and were clearly well done. Still, he'd started, so he would finish the job. Hizashi readjusted his fingers and pulled again, and the collar split down the middle, falling down the sides. The fog swirled around him, tickling down Hizashi's neck before coalescing into a familiar person with blue cloud-like hair, tan skin with just a few freckles, and the most vibrant blue eyes Hizashi'd ever seen outside of a few of Shuta's spells. It was Oboro. He reached up, smiling that old familiar smile, and clung to Hizashi, whose knees buckled, dropping them together. Eventually, though, they had to get up and head back to find Shoyuta and Izuku. Oboro laughed that the tables had been turned. Now Izuku was the child and they were serving as legal guardians. They made it outside, and Oboro went through Tsukachi's processing, declaring that he'd been captured after the incident their second year and trapped in between a cloud of darkness and his proper form ever since, and he wasn't allowed enough space with the shock collar to escape, and when they brought in a child he stayed to raise him well. He'd succeeded, for the most part, and the one who had bound him had decided to enthrall him to get that uncontrolled rage and hate, but it was far enough from what he'd naturally felt that only a few things carried over, such as the distaste for the false heroes. Shoyuta and Izuku were excited, but kept trying to dodge questions like, "Where'd all that blood come from?" and "Why are you on your feet?" and "Wasn't your ankle broken?" and "How did you pull that off?" No, not the Nomu thing, the surviving that impact thing. Eventually, however, the full class and the teachers made it back to UA. There were no major injuries. Ida made sure everyone was alright, and then people's parents picked them up. Izuku was picked up with Hitoshi, since Shoyuta and Hizashi needed a few hours to feed and do paperwork, and Oboro wasn't legally alive again yet. At the Shinso house, Izuku sprawled awkwardly across the faded green beanbag chair that had unofficially become his over several tutoring or post-training sessions. Hitoshi finished putting away his school stuff and sprawled across his own purple paw-print beanbag and Izuku. He wrapped his arms around his torso and rested his head against his chest, listening to the silence where a heartbeat should have been, where the noise if he inhaled would be. Izuku let Hitoshi collect himself, knowing that eventually the young siren would tell him what was on his mind. Eventually, Hitoshi raised his head again. "I want you to feed on me," he declared, then raised a hand to cut off Izuku's protests. "Yes, I know you fed on Tenya a few days ago. Yes, I'm sure about this. I'm of age and there's no rule against it now. I've been thinking about this for a while, and my parents have thoroughly explained it, and so have your coven mates. You were injured 3 days ago, badly enough that a feeding wasn't enough to get it all. You're my friend and I want to help you, and I trust that you know that if you take too much, my parents will hunt you down and stake you." Izuku paused, considering. He knew Hitoshi was making this decision knowing what he was going into, better than most. His parents were some of the best doctors in both the hero and supernatural communities, with many of the strongest owing them debts of their lives or quality of life. If he meant it, and he likely did, then it would be insulting to protest further. If you insist, he responded, tilting Hitoshi's head to the side, a little further forwards than he had for Tenya. Izuku paused, considering, then leaned in, sniffing to find where the vein was closest to the skin, liked twice, then bit. The blood was different from Tenya's, but still had that same vitality. It tasted more fishy, more oily, more sweet. There were some notes he'd only tasted in Hisashi. Finally, he pulled away, the last of the bruises across his ribs fading. Hitoshi wobbled, and Izuku pushed him into bed. I'll get you some juice and some snacks, then we should see if you can sleep for once. He paused, checking the new text. They're back home anyways, and I want coven cuddles too. Hitoshi laughed tiredly, sagging into his pillow. Go cuddle Oboro, I know you've wanted to do so for ages. See you when I see ya. He flapped a hand towards the door. Izuku laughed as well, but he didn't leave until he knew Hitoshi had juice and some cranberry muffins. When he made it home, a nest had already been mostly constructed. He brought a few pillows and a blanket from his room to finish it, and flopped onto the pile of people. They all relaxed, the full coven together for the first time since Oboro's accident. 4 unbeating hearts swelled with love, and the vampires rested deeper than any had managed on their own. Were there still problems? Yes, but they had the peace of now, and for people who lived so long, they had learned to appreciate the now. Nizu sat at his desk, clear of paperwork for once. He was holding a cup of tea, and 4 cups sat on the opposite side, all reeking of blood. None of the vampires perching across from him had touched theirs. And perching was correct, as none of them were sitting correctly. Izuku was crouched on the stool he normally used for those whose mutations meant they couldn't use a chair comfortably, Shoyuda was in the windowsill, Hisashi was on a filing cabinet, and Oboro was on a cloud, halfway to the window or the vents. He sighed, pushed the teacups a little closer to each of them, and pulled out a fresh folder. So, camera footage from the USJ shows that the Nomu had been apprehended and was going to be disabled as it had not shown enough intelligence to understand demands for surrender and a strong enough healing factor that you couldn't do anything else. However, All Might jumped in, made it worse, and caught both of you in his attacks. You still managed to disable the Nomu, but both of you were injured by the interference and were significantly removed from the field of combat. All Might laid claim to the defeat of the Nomu, but when Snipe pointed out your knife in its brainstem, he claimed that you had been trying to attack it, but failed. Snipe knows of your skill with a knife, and passed on the news when he was telling the other teachers. Now, his popularity is even lower and the third-year teachers have expressed a dislike for him returning to the classes, as that kind of lack of caring for his allies or the situation is not a thing that the students should learn. Nizu paused, staring each of them in the eye to make his point. We cannot fire him, his popularity is still too high and we cannot ruin it quickly enough to have him suspended from teaching, and he's enough of an idiot that if years of Sasaki and Torino, plus Nana's teachings, cannot get through to him, then I doubt we can. Shoyuda spoke from his place in the window, shifting to look over the grounds, so peaceful, 3 hours before dawn, a home that was worth fighting for. He's too caught up in his own myth. Sasaki is the best seer in his generation, and after Yagi left him, his message was, he'll doom himself, and if we're not careful, he'll take down all of Japan at minimum. Izuku shifted, more prepared to pounce, and Nizu had to smother a shiver that went up his spine. The symbol of peace is a powerful message, and 30 years of advertising and the support of the HPSC can't just be broken. Despite his unearned fame dash. Nizu broke in, curious. Why would you call it unearned? He relaxed, shifting back into his lecturing pose. Looking at statistics, it is true that whenever All Might is known to be in a city, crime goes down, but when he is known to have left, crime has a corresponding spike that evens out. The larger scale drop in crime is more of an increase in welfare programs, helped along by the fact that he left the Daigoro Foundation to people that are actually inclusive. After so long, I'm not sure he's even aware of 2/3 of the various things owned by prior holders passed on to future ones. Judging by the fact that he's made it older than all of the others, something's different. Hisashi snapped his fingers, the metal creaking as he shifted. Yeah, I remember that one guy. he would have been the fourth. What was his name? He paused, snapping again. Shinomori Hikage. That's the guy. He spent 20 years in the woods, stumbled out at 39 to make a friend, and died of what looked like old age shortly afterwards. Strange, jittery, think it was his quirk warning him of every danger. He called it super anxiety, but his friend, you remember, the one with the tentacles, called it danger sense. That was Daigoro, the one who started the foundation, although it was kept up by several of his sidekicks after his death. Oboro paused. Yeah, he was nice, stronger than he should have been just from that quirk. Didn't he mention he was building up something? And Daigoro spent a lot of time flailing around, like he'd also got a lot stronger. Nizu laughed. Yep, they were the fourth and fifth, Danger Sense and Black Whip respectively. Yagi is eighth and likely last, since the only one Sasaki deemed to have enough sense, young Togoda, was informed and refused, stating that his own quirk was finicky enough that he didn't want to add another that would be difficult, especially he's already known enough that the sudden mutation would be looked into. Oboro smiled, but it soon dropped. Wasn't the quirk called One for All? You're sure about that? Nizu nodded, heart sinking. Yes, it was. Why? Oboro drifted closer to the wall where Shoyuta and Hizashi were, curling up tighter on his cloud. The others shifted, tenser, worried about something hurting the most vivacious of the quartet. For most of the time I was there, the big boss was called Sensei. But the doctor called him something else in the beginning, All for One. The two seem related, especially since 6 years ago, Sensei stopped showing up places in person. And one of the few things he pushed in the enthralling was, specifically, killing All Might. Nizu frowned, setting down his tea. If All for One is still alive, then we may need to make sure UA is safe, but first, you deserve the story. He paused, taking a deep drink, and pushed the other cups forwards. The four also took their cups, and Nizu admired the differences in their magics. Oboro wrapped a cloud-like tendril of his magic delicately around the cup, then pulled it back to his spot. Finding it cold, he wound another tendril into the shape of steam over the top of the tea, which shifted and turned to real steam. The cup was warm again. Hizashi hummed softly, a fine string of golden notes reaching out and pulling the cup to his filing cabinet. A few bars of some song Nizu didn't know, and the cup was steaming warm, along with the space around him. Shoyuta stared at the cup, his eyes glowing bright brass for a moment, and the cup lifted and floated to his perch. A second look in fiery eyes meant the cup was warm. Izuku was the most interesting, opening a quiet rift under the cup, and then opening a second over his hand. The cup fell out, intact, and faintly steaming. Nizu shivered slightly at the casual display of power, the energy in the room, and began his tale. You know that One for All is transferable, as you've seen 4 and 5 pass it on. The story begins with One and his older brother. Their names have been lost to time, although Shigaraki's name is a hint. His legal name was Shimura Tenko, so the Shigaraki name is likely the original name, but I digress. You see, One and his older brother were born at the beginning of the quirked era. One was thought to be quirkless, but his older brother had the ability to give and take quirks. He soon built up a following, quirked people who didn't want their quirks, quirkless people who wanted superpowers, and ended up powerful enough that his criminal empire lasted to this day. At this point, he's the bogeyman of the underworld, as he often rises and falls with no real pattern, at least, no real pattern to the outside. But the meat of this story is still earlier, for One was sick. We can infer that it was something chronic, although genetic or more natural later in life is unknown. All for One gave his younger brother a stockpiling quirk, whether willingly or unwillingly is unknown, although unwillingly is more likely, considering what happened later. Nizu paused, taking another long sip of his tea. For One had an invisible quirk, the ability to pass his quirk on. On its own, it was fairly useless and unrefined, as many first-generation quirks were. You were flipping a coin whether it would be useful, hurtful, or invisible. One ended up opposing his brother and his crimes, and passed on that fight through the generations. No wielder of One for All has stopped, and it is said that All for One seeks to regain the last legacy he has of his brother, and killed each user. 6 years ago, All Might met All for One in combat, and thought he killed him. This fight left him critically injured, missing a lung, his stomach, and limited in the amount of time he could spend using his quirk. He will not want to see that his sacrifice was useless, but he will take up the search for a successor more fervently if he is made aware. Shoyuta frowned. 8 generations of power, even considering that most holders didn't make it past 40, could wreak havoc on anyone not prepared, and considering how uselessly muscled All Might is, preparation might be more than we can safely let somebody take on. It would take months and months of specialized training to even consider it, even among the 3rd years. Izuku shifted on his stool, quietly raising a hand. Not that this isn't interesting, but we can just put this decision off, or give him the runaround for picking a willing candidate and helping them get stronger. The real issue here is what are we going to do with his teaching slot? Hisashi shifted on the cabinet. Why not 2 birds, 1 stone? Boro smacked him. Your jokes aren't funny. Hisashi mock glared. Hawks is trained, has recently gotten a teacher's license, and will likely help us with the other problem, the HPSC's longing to control. We can get him out of there and get somebody who is actually trained to help out the first years. Shoyuta, I love you, but you and can just aren't enough for 40 rambunctious teenagers at once, and you also have your law and ethics class to teach. Shoyuta shrugged, leaning back and setting his empty cup on the sill under his knees. No offense taken, I've been a bit overworked and I know that Snipe's 2nd-year gun class is starting up soon, so we can't use him, and Ectoplasm is going to be heading into his analysis unit, so he won't be available as often either. Hawks is skilled in a variety of areas, and would likely be an asset to staff both in and out of the heroics course. My one hesitation is making sure he's not fully bought into the Hero Commission's bull. Maybe a trial PRD, then bring him in fully if he shows promise. I'd recommend him teaching 1B first, just because that man showed a good bit of favoritism towards 1A and they generally feel a bit less this early in the school year. It's no fault on either side besides the general connection to grades and priority. There's really no way to fix it besides time and full hero course activities, but we can mitigate it, plus, Vlad King is generally better at welcoming new workers. No offense, Shoyuta, but your grumpiness does take some getting used to. Izuku added. Shoyuta shrugged. He knew who he was, and he wasn't interested in pretending to be a happy, welcoming person when he wasn't. Nizu smiled, teeth bared in a parody of his usual false smile. Well, this is still all conjecture. I'm going to bring up these issues in the staff meeting today. Hisashi snickered. You mean the ones Yagi has yet to show up to unless he's reminded and physically walked there? Indeed. We can discuss how to run him around and who would be possible recommendations to hold the power if it is needed. Perhaps the others can also help with ways to remove his greatest weapon, his fame. But there is still a few hours until I can reasonably deal with that, so until then you are free to do as you wish. Oboro hopped off of his cloud and gathered it back into himself, setting his teacup on the desk as he did so. Well, I'd certainly never do it again or wish it on anyone else, but there did come a few benefits from my time away, he said, swirling a portal into existence. The others also climbed down from their perches, leaving their teacups on the desk, and stepped through the portal. On the other side, they stepped out at their home, now filled with more life despite the undead nature of the residents. Tensei had visited when he'd heard, and Nemuri had barely left except to get her lesson plans. Indeed, the two were asleep on the couches, papers piled around them. Shoyuta picked up Tensei and Yamada grabbed Nemuri, taking both to the guest rooms that had essentially become theirs. Izuku settled into his bedroom, sitting at his loom. His door was open, and he could faintly hear the noises of the others settling into their favorite activities. Oboro had pop music playing in the kitchen, although it was quiet enough the sound of a knife working and something bubbling on the stove could still be heard under it. Hisashi was out in the forge, the faint stream of smoke drifting through the open window and the sound of his hammer as he worked on his latest piece ringing through the pre-dawn air. Shoyuta was mixing his glazes in the kitchen, as his pestle served as a counterpoint to the chopping of Oboro's knives and the strains of old shanties vied with the pop songs. Izuku smiled, content with his coven, and turned on his own music player, the opening notes of tales to be told echoing through his room as he started pumping the treadle, passing the shuttle back and forth as the new fabric slowly was woven into existence. When class began, all of 1A was nervously sitting, waiting to see what would be going on. Even Shinso, Ida, and Midoriya, having seen Aizawa intact and fine, were nervous. When Aizawa walked in, one arm bandaged, the whole class was silent for a moment, then exploded. Most wanted to know if he was okay for teaching, while others questioned, hadn't his arms been relatively untouched? Aizawa glared at them, a quick lift of his hair showing his red-eyed gaze that much clearer. The class fell silent, and he paced around the front. I am well and fine for teaching, thank you. Recovery girl would have not let me back if not. And you are correct, Shuji, my arms were fine. This, he raised the bandaged arm, is from getting a blacksmithing hammer thrown at me. Hagakure raised a hand. Why did you get a blacksmithing hammer thrown at you? Because I snuck up on a blacksmith. You've made it through your first week, and the incident at the USJ was no doubt at least a little scarring. All of you have at least one required appointment with Hound Dog, and you are free to request more. All fees for this or any other therapist you seek out if Hound Dog is not a good match for you will be covered by UA, as regular therapy is a hero course requirement. However, there is another challenge coming up. Aizawa paused for effect and to let the chatter rise and fall. The UA Sports Festival. I know, he raised his unbandaged hand. It's possibly a risk and a lot to ask after all this, and you are fully permitted to drop out at any point if you do not feel comfortable. However, security has increased dramatically, and there will be 5 times the patrolling heroes. In addition, your second block this afternoon, we will be welcoming the new first-year heroics teacher, provided 1B hasn't scared them off. The chatter rose, everyone excited for the sports festival, a way to get their names out, a way to show off for the world, and the new teacher, until a red-eyed glare cut them off again. Class was beginning. Earlier that morning, the staff meeting had been full of good ideas, especially as without the ever-present stare of All Might, they were free to be a little lax on their care. Ectoplasm had let his physical body go lax, without the cloak to hide the usual distortions. Snipe was cleaning a grenade casually, seemingly uncaring for the array of small metal pieces drifting around him as he worked a grease-covered rag around the trigger mechanism. Majima was leaning back, a cold compress over his eyes as he complained to Shoyuta about his latest problem child, a mechanical genius from a new support family, but seemingly unable to make anything without exploding it at least once. Hizashi was humming cheerily, letting his magic wash over the room, faint runes around the doors and windows charging as Recovery Girl settled in her seat, wincing as her cane nearly slipped. She'd be rewinding her age soon enough, and her assistants were good enough to cover for her, and her granddaughter appearing. Finally, Nizu brought the meeting to order. I know you have many things to take care of, so let's keep this quick. Our points of order are how to deal with All Might, his replacement as first-year heroics teacher, and the upcoming sports festival. The teachers sat up, many putting away their fidgets, although Snipe merely such to replacing the metal fragments in the grenade's shell. When Nizu ran meetings like this, you didn't waste time asking if he was sure. He was always sure. First All Might. He has proven himself to have failed as a teacher, no matter where we put him. Snipe called out. He's not messing with my second years. We have a smaller class, and it's only thanks to Aizawa's filtering that we've got any unders at all. I won't have him making them feel worse or turning away. Enough of them aren't quite settled in as is. Ectoplasm nodded. The third years all mentioned that his advice usually leads to more property damage and more force, usually dispersing clones when capture is the goal. It's a wonder more people haven't pulled an endeavor on him. At the curious looks, he added, pulled together massive spreadsheets of his faults and circulated them around places people would look for him, as well as point out flaws in his schedule where assassins could hit if they wanted. Nizu smiled. We'll certainly deal with the endeavor problem soon enough, especially since we've got a first-hand account from Yukimura. But All Might is the problem here. My current idea is to have him in a more overlooking role, or helping in strength training. It is hoped that he'll find a successor, but he'll need to get their homeroom teacher's approval as well as mine on who he chooses and when they'll be ready. His time is decreasing, as fighting the Nomu tipped him over from 1 hour to 50 minutes. Either he ends up retiring, unable to be All Might, or he ends up deflating, as some have put it, in public, ruining people's confidence in him either way. Either is fine, and if you are going to harass him into decreasing his time, merely do so in ways that cannot be blamed on you. Now, are there any suggestions for the new first-year heroics teacher? The staff room was quiet, Yamada and Aizawa knowing their boss didn't want them to suggest their idea. Finally, Chio spoke up. It's not so much who do we want as who's available. UA has kept a firm policy of requiring its heroics course teachers to have active licenses, and although the HPSC pressured us into letting All Might in, even he managed to pick up a student teacher's certificate. There's only a few pros with any teaching qualifications that haven't been snapped up by other hero schools. The only ones I can think of are the Idas, Hawks, and Burnin. Majima frowned. But the Idas are already on the lecture circuit, and anyways, we had Ingenium last year and we can't do two from the same agency 2 years in a row. Burnin was good, always got her stuff filed early and complete. Nizu's smile hadn't changed. Unfortunately, she is currently locked into a contract at Endeavor's agency for another 8 months. In addition, she'd need a good bit more bribery to return, as she was a former student of mine. Aizawa sighed. So it's Hawks then, unless you know of anyone else with teaching qualifications. He didn't even have the grace to look abashed. Indeed. The email requesting him for a trial PRD has been drafted and sent, and a faint ding rang through the room, responded to. He'll be free this afternoon. If you would be available to meet him at lunch, as he'll have your class in the first afternoon block. Vlad King sighed. At least you've got a way to balance out the disparity between 1A and 1B. I swear, Aizawa, you don't do anything to deal with the problem. Aizawa shrugged. I have them acting like it doesn't exist. It's illogical, and it's usually gone by second semester anyways. Yamada cleared his throat. Those two could argue for hours about the rivalry, and had done so exactly once before he decided to cut in before they got started. Not that I want to interrupt this riveting argument, but the sports festival? Aizawa was the only one to wince, remembering the threat of riveting him to the wall if he got caught up in another stupid argument. Snipe sat up, his grenade fully assembled. Yeah, why are we holding it? Nizu shrugged. The board insisted, and I've got enough other schemes going on already that I don't have the time to deal with them. But what extra measures do you suggest? Well, extra security is obvious. We can probably get the commission to get extra patrolling heroes, which has the extra advantage of more eyes on our students, Snipe pointed out. Yamada sat back. I've always thought that they make me say too much when they write the taglines for the students, so perhaps I show off how little I can say while filling the air? And you'll help, oh lucky co-commentator, he added, pointing at Aizawa. Aizawa nodded. Solely tactical, but not commenting on limits unless they're obvious, such as a student passing out. We don't want it to be clear we're hiding things unless you're looking for weaknesses broadcast. Ryu raised a hand. No names. Describe what they do use, he shivered, puns if you must, but don't name people. And don't bias people towards any one class. Gen Ed, Management, and Business are irritated about this already. Nizu clapped his hands. All settled? Good. Now, I know many of you have classes that are starting soon, so I'll let you get to that. It was 5 minutes before the bell would ring for lunch, and Aizawa was staring the class into silence once more. Today's class will be sparring. We will be doing alternating sparring and strength training until the sports festival, with the gyms open for individual work after classes. Do note that after the festival we'll counter the flaws you find in your performances, and for the rest of the year, we will not be doing this much focus on raw strength, but getting your basic technique in decent shape for next year. Be aware of this, and I expect you to put effort into this. The bell rang and the class headed to the door. To the door and not through it, as there was a large crowd on the other side. What's going on? Asked Kirishima, pushing his way next to Ida at the front of the class. The crowd seemed to be made up of mostly 1B students, although several general ed and management students were there as well. A boy with prominent eyelashes stepped forwards. We're here to check out the ones who dealt with villains, but I'm not seeing anything too special. Another blonde boy pushed his way to the front. Just like 1A, isn't it, taking all the drama for themselves and pushing the other classes out of the spotlight? He would have gone further, but Ida stepped forwards, hands chopping irritatedly. "How dare you?" he snapped. "How dare you bring up a traumatic experience and claim that we are not special for not being visibly marked by being attacked and having to fight for our lives? How dare you call that taking the drama? Nobody has even spoken about it, and frankly, I for one would rather put it all behind me, and if the rest are like you, then they might not need to have any more drama, as you put it." Some of the students fell back, ashamed, and Ida stalked past, followed by the rest of the class. Kirishima stared the two who had spoken out down, disappointed by his sister class. Not manly brothers. The day of the UA first-year sports festival dawned bright and clear, unfortunately for the two vampires commenting and the one vampire competing. Oboro was laughing at them from inside their dark, shady home, and Shoyuta was grumbling at Hizashi, who actually had sunglasses as part of his costume. But he had to stop as Hizashi slipped into the role of present Mike to welcome the students, and he had to don his own role as Eraserhead. Mike read out his script, excited and peppy in ways that Shoyuta refused to emulate as he continued draining his unfortunately not spiked drink. Below, Midoriya was nervous and twitching, squinting against the bright light, and pressing close to Yukimura. His dad was in the stands somewhere, but the half-Sneguraka was more concerned about his mom, watching from wherever the lovely lawyer that had lent her name to Midoriya had taken her, and his siblings. Midoriya Inko was one of the most feared lawyers in the heroics world, and the fact that she was a harpy was only a small part of it. Natsuo and Fuyumi had inherited their mother's powers more fully and were happy that he knew and they could get out with their mom, and Tuya had written him a letter talking about his work with the Daigoro Foundation's Ops and Extraction team, looking forwards to seeing him and mentioning ways to balance his quirk with his supernatural nature. A girl from 1B, Kendo Itsuka, gave the athlete's oath. Midnight stepped forwards, and a wheel began to spin. When it settled, Midnight called out the words spanning the displays. Obstacle course. Shoyuta was tilted back in his chair, thermos balanced on his forehead, as Mike announced the winners, the next activity, and the break for people to catch their breaths and form teams. Once that was done, Hizashi slumped back next to him. Midoriya was insane. While technically the oldest among the four, with Oboro fitting in between Hizashi and Shoyuta in terms of age, he was still physically the youngest and fully capable of making them feel like they'd be graying if they weren't intentionally keeping themselves looking like they had in their youths. Even the stupid mustache Hizashi had worn during his times at court, and the stubble he couldn't quite ever properly grow out for Shoyuta. The insane boy had cartwheeled across the giant pit and intentionally blown himself up not 3 seconds after Rei's kid had skidded across the finish line, closely followed by Uraraka and Ida. Fourth place, blown off by a lot of the limelights while still showing off, and high enough to be able to pull a ridiculous amount of stunts. On the field below, he was grouping up with Shinso, a pink-haired girl from the support course, and Tokoyami. Neither he nor his shadow had seen fit to inform the Hero Commission that technically he and his bonded spirit were two people, so it still counted. But it was time for the second event to start, and once more Midoriya and his team were pulling off insane stunts. Down on the field below, Midoriya was wondering what Hatsum was thinking, strapping Shinso to a jetpack and launching the whole group of them into the air. She was too busy cackling next to him for him to ask her, but he doubted it would matter. As a scion of several mad scientist bloodlines, he really should have expected something like this, and it was much tamer than some of her forefathers. Back up in the announcer's booth, the event had come to a close, and Mike was shouting out the rankings. In first place, Team Yaoyorozu. In second, Team Minoma. In third, Team Shinsa. And in fourth, Team Chisakuro. Give it up for the victors. Chisakuro was a management student from Nemuri's own class, and the team was made up of 2 support students and Bakugo, having barely scraped it into the sports festival and coming in at 40th after getting stuck in the pile-up with the robots. Notably, neither Kirishima or Tetsu had attempted to help him out. During the break, the pair quietly drank their lunches and talked about their theories for the brackets. The support students were there to show off, the management student withdrew in place of Tetsu, and most of the hero course had heard about why Bakugo had been expelled and held no love for him. The third round stared out fairly sedate, with Midoriya sking Siro's tape into his pockets, showy enough, but it wasn't very clear what Midoriya's quirk was, especially when he pulled the severed tape out and used it to restrain Siro. Both were happy, as Siro had landed a few good hits and Midoriya had been clearly covering his face with most of the pockets he opened. The second match, Kaminari vs. Monoma, went similarly. Showy enough of a fight to keep the audience happy, and neither side was too put out by Monoma's victory. He'd managed to use solid air to keep himself from being electrocuted, and Kaminari still hadn't quite got the hang of the lesser bursts and ended up being shoved out, but at least they'd got some sparring in first. Tokoyami had managed to work with Dark Shadow to startle and trip up Chisakuro, resulting in both being happy. Chisakuro was able to show off managing a motley band, and Tokoyami was getting in practice working with Dark Shadow with more freedom than he usually got. Ida lost to Ishido, a bad matchup as soon as they'd seen it, with Ishido keeping him from building up speed by giving him nowhere to run. Still, he'd hopped from place to place for long enough to make a good showing, and judging by the look on his face when he checked his phone and signed out, he wouldn't be heading on anyways. Shinso was another easy win against Hatsum, although he let her show off before simply getting her to chatter at him and step out. Simple, convenient, and demonstrated skill without being too flashy. Yaoyorozu against Shiozaki was an elegant back and forth for 2 long minutes before Yaoyorozu pulled out Weed Killer and poured it over the vines, letting her push Shiozaki out as she stumbled without their support. Next was one of the tougher fights, Uraraka, one of the more fiery of Aizawa's class, against Bakugo, tempestuous and raging already. For several long minutes, it seemed an even fight, neither managing to get a real advantage over the other. One of the watching pros even heckled Bakugo for going too hard on her, but he was shut down by shouts from the 1A section and Aizawa's biting. If you can't accept that she's a fierce opponent for anyone to face, and you can't see her skill, then you need a different career. Not 2 minutes after he finished, Uraraka dropped the debris she'd been holding up on Bakugo. He managed to get most, but his explosions were slowly losing their coherence and his wrists were shaking, and the last round of boulders ended up burying him when he couldn't use his quirk anymore. Uraraka passed out shortly after, from quirk exhaustion, but she'd won decisively and was met by cheers when she returned, both from the hero course, for such a good fight, and from Bakugo's Gen Ed class for taking him down a peg. Against that, Yukimura and Kirishima's fight was almost dull. Waves of ice against someone who could easily smash his way out ended up getting fairly boring after the first 2 times, and eventually it took 8 fiery darts to get Kirishima to roll over the boundary line trying to put out his uniform. The second round started out with a bang, Midoriya losing to Monoma after the latter jumped him with a pocket still open. He had to dodge, and the only free way that wouldn't end up with part of him exposed to the odd void inside the pockets was over the boundary line. Part of it was his poor daylight vision and all the dust, but Monoma seemed satisfied. Tokoyami and Ishido had a short back and forth, but eventually he managed to push her towards the edge of the field enough that Dark Shadow managed to push her the rest of the way over. Yaoyorozu beat Shinso, although after she made earplugs so as not to reply to him, it was mostly a matter of martial skill, and without a staff and stumbling over his song's interruption, Shinso was slowly but surely pushed outside the ring. Uraraka vs. Yukimura was another interesting fight, as whenever he sent ice at her, she simply floated it. The fight was a draw, as he passed out from overchilling himself and she passed out from overexertion. Uraraka woke up first and was given the victory. The semifinals were loud and exciting, although some were murmuring on how even the fights looked. Nobody had been pushed straight out, they all managed to put up at least some fight. Tokoyami beat Monoma, as he was unable to properly copy Dark Shadow and ended up falling off his solid air block as it timed out and was promptly shoved out by a waiting Tokoyami. Uraraka vs. Yaoyorozu ended up going to Yaoyorozu, as the ponytailed girl had more ammunition and stamina left than the staggering brunette. It was a quick fight, as Uraraka ended up wobbling enough that Yaoyorozu simply picked her up and tossed her onto the waiting stretcher bot. Since Uraraka was out for the count, Monoma ended up making third. Tokoyami vs. Yaoyorozu was settled, as previously determined, by arm wrestling as their statement against the over-commercialization of heroic students. Yaoyorozu eventually won, although it was close. They left arm in arm, chatting about Poe and how pretty ravens were when flying and how he did them dirty. All Might looked somewhat confused as he delivered the medals and passed on his words of inspiration, although Tokoyami and Monoma looked ready to commit murder. And Yaoyorozu looked like she was planning said murder, or perhaps a properly sad statement on the occasion of the death of such a beloved hero. Wasn't it a shame? Aizawa was proud of the kids, as they had shown off their skills well, even the ones that didn't make it to the third round, and they would likely be receiving good news when internship requests came in.